Chapter 4169. The morale of the Rebel Alliance's army was high, and their battle cries shook the heavens. The more than 9,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command were trembling with fear. Before the Imperial Tutor gave the order to retreat, many of the soldiers couldn't help but retreat to the Grotto Heaven's entrance. As long as the Imperial Tutor gave the order, they could immediately pass through the space gate and escape back to the Shura Grotto Heaven. The Imperial Tutor certainly knew that the current situation was not suitable for battle. He had to retreat back to the Shura Grotto Heaven and let the soldiers rest for a while to stabilize their morale. Only then could they compete with the Rebel Alliance. However, he couldn't give the order to retreat directly. Otherwise, the more than 9,000 soldiers would panic and rush to the Grotto Heaven's entrance like a swarm of bees. There would definitely be problems. He could only let the soldiers maintain their formation and retreat into the Grotto Heaven in an orderly manner. He and the many divine generals couldn't retreat first. They had to bring up the rear for the soldiers and prevent the Rebel Alliance from pursuing them. How could the Rebel Alliance let go of such a great opportunity? Seeing the Imperial Tutor's soldiers retreating quickly, Ji Tianqing decisively waved his divine sword and gave chase. More than 10,000 soldiers also let out battle cries and used all kinds of divine powers to attack the Imperial Tutor's soldiers. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Divine light danced in the sky as all kinds of destructive divine arts poured down like a torrential flood, bombarding the Imperial Preceptor and thousands of soldiers. If it was a normal battle, the Imperial Tutor's side would be at a disadvantage, but they could resist and neutralize the attacks with all their might. However, it was different now. The Imperial Tutor's soldiers were in a hurry to escape and didn't have the heart to continue fighting. More than 2,000 people had already escaped back to the Grotto Heaven. Another 2,000 were retreating, and only 5,000 soldiers were casting spells to resist. It wasn't hard to imagine that they wouldn't be able to withstand the fierce attacks of Ji Tianqing and more than 10,000 soldiers. Bang, bang, bang. A series of muffled explosions sounded. Dazzling divine light burst out from the crowd, and deafening loud noises sounded. Many people were blasted into smithereens on the spot. Not even their corpses remained. There were still many soldiers who were lucky enough to survive, but they were heavily injured. Their appearance was extremely miserable, and their combat strength was severely weakened. Fortunately, the Imperial Tutor and the Heavenly Generals did their best to cast spells and protect the soldiers as they retreated. Otherwise, their casualties would be even more tragic. In this round of ferocious attacks, another 500 soldiers were killed and close to 1,000 were injured. The Imperial Tutor was also anxious. He began to urge his subordinates to hurry back to the Azura Paradise. Ji Tianqing and the soldiers of the Rebel Alliance did not stop. They immediately cast powerful spells and launched a second round of fierce attacks on the Imperial Tutor. The Imperial Tutor and the Divine Generals were beaten to a pulp, their injuries worsening. Thousands of soldiers were also beaten into a sorry state. They covered their heads and fled like rats. The number of casualties continued to increase. Finally, 100 breaths had passed. The Imperial Tutor's subordinates all retreated back to the Azura Paradise. Even the Imperial Tutor and the Divine Generals who brought up the rear turned around and entered the spatial gate. At this time, the Imperial Preceptor's 9,000-plus soldiers were only left with around 5,000. At least 4,000 soldiers were killed in the process of retreating, and more than 20 Divine Kings were taken care of by Ji Tianqing. The Imperial Tutor's forces were further weakened. Even if they escaped back to the Azura Paradise, they did not have much of a chance of winning. Ji Tianqing reckoned that when the Anti-Rebels Alliance breached the entrance of the Grotto Heaven and slaughtered the Shura Grotto Heaven, Emperor Preceptor's trump card would be revealed. After the Imperial Tutor and the others escaped to the Azura Paradise, they hurriedly closed the entrance. The 300 feet tall spatial gate disappeared. In the seemingly empty sky, there was actually an invisible spell formation. If they could crack or break that spell formation, they would be able to enter the Azura Paradise. More than 10,000 soldiers were filled with killing intent and high morale. They were about to charge forward and break that spell formation together. However, Ji Tianqing raised his hand to stop them. He could already see that the entrance to the Azura Paradise was also a supreme-grade, king-level divine array. If more than 10,000 soldiers attacked together, in addition to the 21 divine warships, they could indeed break that spell formation. However, it would take a lot of time, and the amount of divine power it would consume was immeasurable. Ji Tianqing let the soldiers rest while he took the opportunity to treat their injuries. He used the god's mystic technique to carefully observe the invisible spell formation, looking for a way to break it. Although the Azura God Emperor had personally set up the spell formation at the entrance of the Azura Paradise, it was very profound and exquisite. However, Ji Tianqing was most proficient in the Sword Dao and the Array Dao, and his attainments in them were also extraordinarily high. After observing for a few minutes, he figured out the structure of the spell formation. He frowned and pondered. After deducing for a few minutes, he found a way to break it. Then, he started to cast spells to break the spell formation. Yin Yao, Ji Ku, Bai Feng, and the other god kings were assisting him at any time. It was much easier to find a way to break the spell formation. Originally, Ji Tianqing would have needed a few hours to break this spell formation. However, with the help of so many god kings, he only needed an hour to successfully break a hole in the spell formation. Then, everyone worked together to enlarge that hole by more than 10 times, making it 30,000 feet long and wide. Everyone boarded the divine warships and flew into the Azura Paradise under the lead of the god-slaying warships. After the Imperial Tutor fled back to the Azura Paradise with the remaining 5,000 soldiers, he wanted to set up an ambush at the entrance of the Azura Paradise. He knew that Kenshin would definitely have a way to break the spell formation at the entrance of the Azura Paradise and lead the fleet into the Azura Paradise. If he could ambush them at the entrance, he would definitely be able to catch them off guard. However, the problem was that most of the 5,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor were either lightly or heavily injured. Their morale was also very low. In addition, there were 10,000 soldiers guarding the Azura Divine Palace. They could not be easily mobilized. The Azura Divine Palace was the most important. It was the final fortress. He could not afford to lose it. He could not mobilize the 10,000 soldiers. If he wanted to ambush the Rebel Alliance with just the 5,000 soldiers by his side, it would be no different from sending them to their deaths. With this thought, the Imperial Tutor dismissed the idea of an ambush. He simply took the 5,000 soldiers and obediently returned to the Azura Divine Palace. He let the injured soldiers rest and recuperate. Then, he commanded the 10,000 soldiers guarding the Azura Divine Palace to prepare for war. After arranging all these matters, he thought to himself, these 15,000 soldiers and the spell formation around the Azura Divine Palace are our final barrier. Success or failure depends on this battle. Thinking of this, he subconsciously turned around and looked at the depths of the Azura Divine Palace. He silently prayed in his heart, in 6 hours, it will be 49 days. You should be done, right? If something goes wrong today, I'm afraid I won't be able to give you an explanation. I can only become a dead soul under Kenshin's sword. Everything depends on you. The Imperial Tutor pursed his lips. His expression and mood became very serious. His hand gripped the hilt of his divine sword tightly. He knew that it would take the Rebel Alliance at least a day to break into the Azura Paradise. Even if Kenshin personally took action with the help of many God Kings, it would still take several hours. There should be no problem with the top-grade, king-level spell formation at the entrance lasting for 6 hours, right? End of chapter. Chapter 4170. In fact, Ji Tianqing, with the help of many God Kings, took less than 2 hours to enter the Azura Paradise. He originally thought that the Imperial Tutor would set up traps and ambushes near the entrance of the paradise. This way, even if they couldn't destroy the Rebel Alliance's fleet, they could still severely injure them. However, the 5,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor were definitely not enough. At the very least, they would need to add the 10,000 soldiers guarding the Azura Divine Palace. If the Imperial tutor was bold enough to do this, he would definitely reap some benefits. As for what the outcome would be, that was unknown. Unfortunately, the Imperial tutor was never a bold or crazy person. He was more cautious than ordinary people. Therefore, Ji Tianxing was a little disappointed that he didn't see any ambushes near the entrance of the paradise. However, according to the usual practice, the Imperial tutor had set up some traps and formations near the entrance of the paradise in advance. His goal was to create trouble for the Rebel Alliance and delay them. However, Ji Tianxing was already prepared. He used the Divine Eye secret technique to see through the traps and formations and avoided them one by one. As a result, the Rebel Alliance was indeed delayed a little, but it didn't matter much. The Azura Paradise was very big. It had a vast territory, rich resources, and abundant divine power. There was no need to say much about this. At this time, this beautiful world was filled with a heavy and oppressive atmosphere. Wherever the Rebel Alliance's fleet passed, there was no living person in sight. Ji Tianxing believed that the Imperial tutor must have already dismissed the miscellaneous personnel and those who didn't have any combat strength. As for the Imperial tutor's soldiers, they must have gathered near the Azura Divine Palace, waiting to fight to the death with the Rebel Alliance. Ji Tianxing wasn't in a hurry. The god-slaying battleship led the 20 battleships and advanced at a moderate pace, heading straight for the Azura Divine Palace. During the 400,000-mile journey, they naturally encountered many traps and ambushes. These were all set up by the Imperial tutor a few months ago. Back then, the Imperial tutor had already predicted that this day would come. However, Ji Tianxing was always able to detect danger in advance and cleverly avoid it. Half an hour later, the fleet arrived safely at the Azura Divine Palace. It was a group of palaces with a radius of 1,000 miles. There were more than 60 lofty mountains, and each mountain peak had palaces and residences. They were all luxuriously built. The main peak in the middle was also the most majestic peak. The palace at the top of the mountain was the most majestic and sacred. That was the Azura Divine Palace. The Rebel Alliance's fleet stopped 1,000 miles away from the palace complex. This was because the group of palaces had already activated the Mountain Protection Formation, which covered a radius of 1,000 miles and enveloped the dozens of mountains. This incomparably exquisite protective array was the most critical barrier of the Azura Divine Palace. It was a genuine top-grade king level divine array. The 7-foot-thick dark red light barrier had endless blood flowing around it, releasing a soaring, killing intent and a sharp aura. There were also 12,000 fully armed soldiers guarding the edge of the great array, glaring at the Rebel Alliance's fleet. The other 3,000 soldiers had suffered heavy injuries. They were the group that had retreated from the Heavenly Grotto entrance. At this moment, they were treating their injuries in the palace. The Imperial tutor and the 9 divine generals stood in the air above the Azura Divine Palace's square, looking at the Rebel Alliance's fleet. At this point, this was the final battle. Both sides didn't waste any words and directly started fighting. The 21 battleships of the Rebel Alliance all activated their attack formations, crazily accumulating their divine power and releasing an overwhelming barrage of cannon fire and pillars of divine power. Bang! 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 Deafening explosions erupted, resounding through the horizon. The dense pillars of light that filled the sky like a rain of arrows also ruthlessly bombarded the dark red mountain protection formation. Countless pillars of divine power exploded, bursting into millions of fragments of divine light. The dark red light barrier that spanned 1,000 miles shook violently, flashing with divine light. The cannon fire of the 20 high-grade king level god battleships didn't damage the mountain protection formation. At most, they could only consume its energy. Only the several hundred pillars of light released by the god-slaying battleships managed to create several dozen cracks on the dark red light barrier. However, the light barrier was simply too thick, so a few cracks didn't matter. The Rebel Alliance's first round of attacks couldn't even shake the mountain protection formation. The 10,000 soldiers inside the formation laughed at them. The imperial tutor waved his hand and gave the order for a counterattack. Thus, several hundred soldiers used their arts to control the mountain protection formation, releasing divine light that blotted out the sky and smashed into the Rebel Alliance's fleet like a flood. The reason why they used the mountain protection formation to counterattack and didn't let the 10,000 soldiers attack was to preserve their strength. The imperial tutor knew that no matter how strong the Rebel Alliance was, they wouldn't be able to do anything to the mountain protection formation in the short term. He could use the mountain protection formation's power to consume the Rebel Alliance's strength. In addition, even if the 11,000 soldiers attacked with all their strength, they wouldn't be able to defeat the Rebel Alliance. It would be a waste of energy. It was better to stall for time and wait for that trump card to appear before fighting the Rebel Alliance to the death. That was the wiser move. The imperial tutor's move was indeed effective. More than 10,000 soldiers remained in a spectating state, and only a few hundred soldiers controlled the mountain protection formation. They successfully stalled the Rebel Alliance. The 21 god battleships attacked with all their might, expending countless resources and continuously releasing cannon fire and pillars of light to bombard the mountain protection formation. However, the mountain protection formation wasn't damaged. At most, the god-slaying battleships only managed to create some cracks. No matter how much the mountain protection formation shook and trembled, it was extremely safe inside the formation. There was no danger at all. The more than 10,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor's command laughed even more arrogantly when they saw the Rebel Alliance's fleet bombarding the mountain protection formation to no avail. They mocked the Rebel Alliance without restraint, and their morale rose as well. They felt much more at ease. The mountain protection formation gave them a sense of security that was far more effective than the imperial tutor's empty slogans. Just like that, the two sides were in a stalemate for about 15 minutes. The 21 god battleships of the Rebel Alliance continuously bombarded the mountain protection formation more than 100,000 times, consuming at least 200 billion worth of resources. Fortunately, Ji Tianxing was now the richest person in the world and had hundreds of trillions worth of resources. That was why he could withstand such consumption. Unfortunately, even after consuming so many cultivation resources, they didn't achieve any results. The mountain protection formation was still intact. Even though there were many cracks and dents on its surface, it wasn't really broken. Under the control of hundreds of soldiers, the cracks and dents on the surface of the mountain protection formation were also slowly being repaired. At most, after half a day, those cracks and dents would disappear, and the mountain protection formation would be restored to its original state. This made Ji Tianxing a little depressed. He could already tell that the imperial tutor wanted to stall for time and weaken the Rebel Alliance's combat power before finding an opportunity to counterattack. Since that was the case, he definitely couldn't let the imperial tutor get what he wanted. Thus, he decisively ordered the fleet to stop attacking and let the soldiers rest for a while. Then he asked the White Dragon to increase the power of the god-slaying battleships to the maximum and attack the mountain protection formation at all costs, concentrating on one point. He also held the Sword of Burial of Heaven and the Divine Hammer and attacked personally. End of chapter. Chapter 4171. Sword Rain. Before the imperial tutor could react, Ji Tianxing flew high into the sky, pointed his sword at the sky, and let out an angry roar. He used all his strength and used his ultimate skill, vowing to break the protective formation as soon as possible. Dazzling starlight immediately lit up in the sky. 90,000 starlight dots appeared. The densely packed stars poured down like a meteor shower, bringing with them a terrifying power that could destroy the heavens and earth. Within the protective formation, the 10,000 soldiers were discussing and mocking. Why did the Rebel Alliance's fleet stop attacking? At this moment, they saw the god-slaying battleship attacking the formation alone, and Kenshin was personally attacking. Everyone stopped mocking and sneering, and they sized up Kenshin with curiosity and vigilance. Everyone had heard of the sword god's fame and his terrifying strength and methods. It It was only at this moment that they truly witnessed the sword god's most proficient sword technique. Countless people looked up at the sky and saw the dazzling stars in the sky, and they were shocked. In the next moment, they saw clearly that the 90,000 light spots falling from the sky were not stars. They were 90,000 giant swords of stars. Each giant sword was thousands of feet long, and they were condensed and contained supreme divine power that could destroy everything. The sword rain had not yet arrived, but the 10,000 soldiers could already feel the terrifying divine power and the terrifying sword intent. At this moment, they'd experienced exactly how formidable the sword god was. Everyone's expression became serious and grave, and their hearts were also in their mouths, and they were filled with deep worry. Previously, they had been very confident in the protective formation, but now they could not help but feel worried and apprehensive. Could this invincible protective mountain array really block the sword god's ultimate sword technique? Just as the soldiers were in a daze, the imperial tutor came back to his senses and was also shocked. He shouted anxiously, "What are you waiting for?" Quickly, everyone worked together to support the formation. To be on the safe side, the imperial tutor had no choice but to order all the soldiers to use their arts to increase the power of the protective formation. The protective formation was too important, and there could not be any mistakes. More than 10,000 soldiers came to their senses and hurriedly cast spells to increase the power of the protective formation. Unfortunately, they were still one step too slow. Boom, 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 boom. In the next instant, the 90,000 stellar swords slammed into the dark red protective formation with boundless divine might. An earth-shattering explosion erupted. It was deafening, and it spread for tens of thousands of miles. The huge mountain-guarding formation was immediately submerged by the boundless starlight. When it suffered the terrifying impact, it also shook violently. Previously, cracks and dents had appeared in the mountain-protecting array. The god-slaying battleship had also concentrated its firepower on the damaged area. At this moment, the Rain of Swords was also under Ji Tianxing's control, deliberately bombarding that area repeatedly. Thus, amidst a series of loud rumbles, everyone clearly heard a burst of kacha-kacha shattering sound. The soldiers who were channeling their arts and injecting divine power into the protective formation subconsciously looked up. Then they saw a frightening scene. Under the continuous bombardment of the 90,000 giant swords, the incomparably thick protective mountain formation was actually densely packed with cracks in an area of 10,000 zhong in radius. The cracks were rapidly spreading, deepening, and thickening. There were even dark red fragments of divine light bursting out. When the 90,000 star swords finished their first bombardment, the center of the fissure that was tens of thousands of feet wide had clearly caved in. The thousands of cracks also gradually gathered together, leaving only a few hundred cracks. At this moment, the cracks were basically tens of thousands of feet long and dozens of feet wide. Everyone's gaze could already see the sky outside through those cracks. Without a doubt, the protective formation that was said to be invincible had finally been breached. It was just that the cracked area had not collapsed yet, so there were no huge gaps or holes. But everyone knew that it was only a matter of time. Quickly cast spells to support the formation and repair the cracks. The Imperial Tutor's expression changed immediately. He anxiously roared and hurriedly cast spells to control the formation. More than 10,000 soldiers panicked. All of them channeled their divine power into the protective formation without caring about anything else. Although everyone tried their best to increase the strength of the formation and repair the cracks and holes, the speed of the formation was too slow. However, the speed of repair was simply too slow, far slower than the speed of destruction. After the first round of bombardment, only a little more than 20,000 of the 90,000 starry swords had exploded. There were still more than 60,000 stellar swords left, and they actually formed a huge sword formation in the sky and continued to bombard the broken area. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The sword lights flew back and forth as fast as lightning, emitting sharp, whistling sounds. Bam, bam, bam. The stellar swords kept bombarding the cracked area, causing a series of loud, dull sounds and splashes of starlight and red light to fill the sky. Clearly, the stellar swords were constantly shattering and dissipating. But the cracked area was also constantly expanding, sinking, and splashing divine light fragments. Everyone saw with their own eyes that the cracks in the area were rapidly expanding and gaps and holes were gradually appearing. Such an outcome caused the soldiers under the Imperial Preceptor to be filled with worry and anxiety. On the other hand, the 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance were excited and spirited. They saw the hope of victory again. At this time, Ji Tianxing waved the divine hammer again and smashed out 98 beams of divine light continuously at the cracked area. Boom, boom, boom. Another loud explosion could be heard. That region began to shatter at an even faster rate, and even more fragments of divine light splashed out. The power of the formation was weakening, and the thickness of the light wall was decreasing. The gaps and holes were also getting bigger and bigger. As Ji Tianxing raised the Sword of Burial of Heaven, he absorbed the power of the five elements world and slashed out a sword of annihilation. At this moment, not only the Imperial Tutor's pupils constricted, but his face was also full of shock. Even the 10,000-plus soldiers under his command felt their hearts skip a beat as their expressions changed drastically. Boom! Crack! The next moment, an earth-shattering sound burst out. Under everyone's watchful eyes, the Sword of Annihilation struck the protective mountain array and split the cracked area into millions of pieces. Countless dark red divine light fragments splashed out, and a huge gap with a radius of 10,000 feet appeared. Violent and devastating shock waves crashed into the protective mountain array, causing it to shake violently. The 11,000 soldiers in the array were also swept up by the shock waves. They were thrown off their feet and screamed in agony. Just like that, the Imperial Tutor's strongest barrier, the protective mountain array, was broken. At the same time, a few hundred soldiers were unlucky enough to be swept up by the shock waves and died on the spot. Next, Ji Tianxing didn't need to give any orders. The 21 divine warships, which had been ready for a long time, unleashed all their cannons and light beams toward the gap in the protective mountain array. Boom, boom, boom. Following a series of loud noises, the gap doubled in size, and countless cracks appeared around it. In this way, it was impossible for the Imperial Tutor and his soldiers to repair the protective mountain array. Chapter 41-72. Kill. The protective array has been broken. Kill them all. Victory belongs to us. The boundless heaven continent belongs to us. The protective array had been broken, causing the morale of the Rebel Alliance's soldiers to soar. They shouted excitedly, wanting to rush out of the divine warships and charge into the protective array to kill all the soldiers under the Imperial Tutor. Then, the army would occupy the Azura Divine Palace and declare victory. However, Ji Tianxing did not give the order, and the soldiers would not act on their own. They still followed the order, holding their weapons tightly and waiting patiently. The 21 divine warships were not in a hurry to rush into the protective array. They were still thousands of miles away from the array, constantly firing cannons and light beams. With every breath, thousands of cannons and light beams would pass through the gap in the protective array and blast toward the Imperial Tutor and the tens of thousands of soldiers. Ji Tianxing's goal was obvious. First, he would use the warship's cannons to kill the Imperial Tutor and his soldiers from a distance, further weakening the enemy's strength. When the enemy had suffered heavy casualties and their combat strength was weak, he would send the Rebel Alliance's army to charge into the protective array. By doing so, he could effectively preserve the strength of his side and reduce casualties. However, the disadvantage was also obvious, and that was that it consumed too many cultivation resources. However, Ji Tianxing controlled almost the entire boundless heaven continent and carried hundreds of trillions worth of resources with him. He did not care about this consumption at all. Boom, 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 boom. The cannons fired continuously, and the loud sounds echoed between heaven and earth. Inside the protective formation, The imperial preceptor and his subordinates were suffering unspeakably. Seeing that the protective array had been breached and the gap had expanded to a radius of 20 miles, the imperial tutor could only give the order to give up. He took the lead to use his ultimate skill and joined forces with the 11,000 soldiers to resist the bombardment of the anti-rebel fleet. Unfortunately, their strength was limited. At most, they could block and neutralize 80% of the cannons. In the end, 20% of the cannons and light beams would bombard the crowd, causing many casualties. With every breath, dozens of soldiers would be killed on the spot. It was a scene of flesh and blood flying in all directions. The area within a radius of 1,000 miles was drowned in dazzling divine light. As the imperial tutor held on, he repeatedly turned back to look at the Azura divine palace. He anxiously muttered in his heart, "We can't hold on any longer. Why haven't you made a move yet?" However, the powerhouse he was relying on didn't seem to hear his prayers. There was no response from the Azura divine palace. 100 breaths of time quickly passed. At this moment, more than half of the mountains and forests within 1,000 miles of the protective formation had been destroyed. At least 100 palaces and residences were blown into ruins by the overwhelming cannon fire and pillars of light. Only half of the palaces were protected by defensive formations and could still hold on. However, there was no doubt that the palaces and mountains protected by the formation would not be able to hold on for long and would eventually turn into dust. The imperial tutor and many of the god kings were injured, and over 2,000 of the 11,000 soldiers were killed. Only 9,000 soldiers were still bitterly holding on. However, their combat strength was rapidly weakening as they were forced to retreat by the overwhelming cannon fire. The imperial tutor's heart was burning with anxiety. He could only order the 3,000 soldiers who were hiding in the palace to treat their injuries to join the battle. These 12,000 soldiers were the last of the imperial tutor's forces. If these soldiers were also killed, then he would have no soldiers to use. At that time, even if that trump card appeared, he would be powerless to reverse the situation and would not be able to defeat the Rebel Alliance. After all, the Rebel Alliance still had more than 16,000 soldiers. Moreover, they were in peak condition and had ample combat strength. Boom, boom, boom. The anti-rebel fleet's cannon fire continued. The soldiers operating the divine warships had never been so happy and excited as they were at this moment. Inside the protective formation, palaces and residences were destroyed one after another, and batches of the Azura God Emperor's minions were killed. They were in high spirits. Another 100 breaths of time passed. The imperial tutor and the divine generals were in an even more sorry state. They were all covered in wounds, and their hair was disheveled. 2,000 of the 12,000 soldiers had also been killed. Only 10,000 soldiers were left. The imperial tutor knew that he could not continue fighting like this. In at most an hour, the last 10,000 soldiers would be completely wiped out. Therefore, he could only lead the 10,000 soldiers to retreat as they fought and retreated toward the Azura divine palace. Seeing this, the Rebel Alliance's fleet was not in a hurry to chase after them. Under the command of Ji Tianxing, they first concentrated their firepower on the protective formation and further widened the gap. In a short while, half of the protective formation was destroyed. The remaining half of the dark red light barrier also collapsed and dissipated into the air. The protective formation was completely destroyed. Even if the Azura God Emperor came personally, he would not be able to repair it in a short time. Ji Tianxing was finally relieved and ordered all the soldiers to attack. Swish! 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 15,000 soldiers of various races rushed out of the 20 divine warships. 200 to 300 people stayed behind on each divine warship. They were responsible for controlling the divine warships and continuing to suppress the imperial tutor's army with firepower. Ji Tianxing, the patriarchs, and the powerhouses led the 15,000 soldiers and steadily approached the Azura divine palace. Seeing that the imperial preceptor and his soldiers had lost their barrier, they suffered heavy casualties in the sky filled with cannon fire, and their numbers decreased sharply. They could only escape into the final fortress, the Azura Divine Palace. The Azura Divine Palace was protected by 2 layers of top-grade divine arrays. Its defensive power was stronger than the protective formation and more difficult to destroy. The Imperial Tutor calculated that as long as they hid in the Azura Divine Palace and supported the protective formation with all their strength, they would be able to delay for a few hours. As for after a few hours, if their trump card did not appear, they could only perish. With this thought in mind, the Imperial Tutor personally cast a spell and opened the gates of the Azura Divine Palace. Ka! The 1,000-foot-tall bronze gates slowly opened. The Imperial Tutor and his soldiers were about to cross the gates and rush into the Azura Divine Palace. At this moment, a boundless blood-colored torrent suddenly surged out from the spacious hall behind the gates. Shwa! The blood-colored torrent surged out, carrying with it a boundless divine might and bloody intent. It flew into the air above the square outside the Divine Palace. Under the gazes of more than 20,000 people, this 10,000-foot-long torrent of blood-colored torrent twisted and condensed in the air, quickly condensing into a human figure. Divine light flashed and bloody flames rose. A 1,000-foot-tall divine spirit with 6 blood-colored wings on its back appeared in front of everyone. This blood-red divine spirit was covered in pitch-black armor formed from the aura of death, covering 80% of its body. It had a massive head, long purple hair, and 6 blood-colored wings. It also had a ferocious and majestic face. Like a huge mountain, he hovered over the square, gazing at the soldiers of the Anti-Rebellious League with an expressionless face. Suddenly, the 15,000 soldiers felt a surge of pressure. Fear and awe rose in their hearts, and they couldn't help but stop in their tracks. The Imperial Tutor and his soldiers all revealed expressions of surprise and disbelief. They let out earth-shattering cheers. Chapter 4173. His Majesty the God Emperor. His Majesty the God Emperor has returned. Greetings, His Majesty the God Emperor. At this moment, the Imperial Tutor and the nearly 10,000 soldiers under his command all exclaimed in excitement and disbelief. Everyone was excited and pleasantly surprised, and they could not help but shout. A moment ago, they were still worried, anxious, and desperate. But now, their hanging hearts had all settled back into their stomachs, and they smiled as if they had been relieved of a heavy burden and had survived a disaster. The battle was not over yet, and the outcome of the battle was still uncertain. But in the hearts of these 10,000 soldiers, they had already won, and they were safe, because their supreme overlord, the Azura God Emperor, had returned. In their knowledge, only the Azura God Emperor was truly invincible. Although Kenshin was powerful and terrifying, he could not be compared to the Azura God Emperor. That's right, that giant black-armored god thousands of feet tall was like the Grim Reaper who controlled hell. He was the famous Azura God Emperor. Ever since the Azura God Emperor ruled the boundless heaven continent, he had handed over the power to the Imperial Tutor and the Meng Shuai. And he was obsessed with studying the mystery of the gray fog in the outer void, and he almost never asked about the boundless heaven continent's affairs, and he basically never showed his face. Even so, there were statues of him in every city on the boundless heaven continent. Therefore, as long as it was a citizen of the boundless heaven continent, there was no one who did not know the Azura God Emperor. While the Emperor's preceptor and the 10,000 soldiers were cheering, the 15,000 soldiers of the Anti-Rebels Alliance were also dumbfounded. The 20 divine warships stopped attacking, and the soldiers operating the divine warships were stunned. Even the White Dragon was stunned. It paused for a moment before continuing to release cannon fire and light pillars. The 15,000 soldiers of the 20 ancient clans and sects were also stunned in place, staring at the Azura God Emperor with their mouths agape. Everyone's eyes widened and their faces turned ugly. Deep fear was hidden in their eyes. In fact, many of the Divine Lord Realm experts who were slightly less courageous had their heads bowed, their faces ashen. They couldn't withstand the killing intent and pressure of the Azura God Emperor. As the saying goes, A person's name is like a tree's shadow. The five god emperors were supreme and invincible gods in the eyes of all living beings in the god realm. This concept, after thousands of years of accumulation, had long been deeply rooted. Even if these 15,000 soldiers had followed the powerful Kenshin and won every battle, they would never have been defeated. However, the appearance of the Azura god emperor filled their hearts with fear and despair. It was as if they were witnessing the descent of death. It couldn't be helped. In everyone's subconscious, there was a conclusion. Although Kenshin was strong, he was still no match for the Azura god emperor. At the very least, the current Kenshin wasn't qualified yet. Therefore, the faces of the 20 patriarchs and sect leaders were very ugly, and they were also very guilty. They had already expected that today's ending would be rewritten. All their previous victories would be overturned. The Rebel Alliance was on the verge of conquering the Azura Divine Palace and completely controlling the boundless Heaven Continent. However, with the appearance of the Azura God Emperor, the Imperial Tutor would be able to make a comeback. That's right. To the Imperial Preceptor and the 10,000 soldiers under his command, this was a reversal of the situation. When the Azura God Emperor appeared, Ji Tianxing subconsciously stopped in his tracks and frowned as he stared at the other party. At this time, a thought flashed through his mind. As I expected, the Imperial Tutor's final trump card can only be the Azura God Emperor. In fact, this was a very simple question without any suspense. Even the God Generals and God Kings under the Imperial Tutor felt a sense of realization when they saw the Azura God Emperor appear. Hearing the Imperial Tutor and the soldiers shouting the name of the Azura God Emperor and saluting with fanaticism, Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows. He used the Divine Eye secret technique and stared at the Azura God Emperor, carefully observing and analyzing. At first, he was also a little shocked, thinking that the Azura God Emperor's original body had returned. If that was the case, then he didn't have the confidence to defeat the Azura God Emperor. However, he still thought that it was unlikely. In the eyes of the Azura God Emperor, the mystery of the gray fog in the outer space was definitely more important than the boundless Heaven Continent. And the facts proved that Ji Tianxing's analysis was completely correct. After careful observation, he discovered that the Azura God Emperor in front of him was not the original body, but an avatar. However, this avatar was a little strange. It seemed to have been refined using some sort of refining and sacrificial method, so that this avatar was very similar to the original body, and there were almost no flaws. Because of this, except for the Imperial Tutor, the tens of thousands of soldiers all thought that the Azura God Emperor's original body had returned. Now that he was sure that this was the Azura God Emperor's avatar, Ji Tianxing breathed a sigh of relief. He didn't have much confidence in dealing with the Azura God Emperor's original body. However, he was confident in dealing with an avatar, even if it was a specially enhanced version. At this moment, the Azura God Emperor looked down at Ji Tianxing and spoke. Long Tian, you didn't think that this emperor would be waiting for you here, did you? The Azura God Emperor's voice was deep like muffled thunder, and it reverberated between heaven and earth, containing a powerful aura and intimidation. However, Ji Tianxing stood proudly in front of him, and his aura and aura were not suppressed in the slightest. Is it that hard to guess? For nearly half a year, the Imperial Tutor has no one he can use, and he hasn't made any moves or plans. He's been waiting for death. However, he's not in a hurry, and he looks as if he has a card up his sleeve. I can guess that you must have informed him that you'll be back at the critical moment. Otherwise, how could he have been so calm? The Azura God Emperor frowned, and his crimson eyes flashed with a cold sneer. Ah, that's true. If you can't even analyze this, then you don't deserve to be called Kenshin. You've been invincible for the past year, and you've conquered 99 domains. But now that this emperor has returned, everything you've done will be for naught. You're a smart person, and you should know that you've already lost. Stop wasting time, admit defeat, and surrender. The Azura God Emperor stared at Ji Tianxing, and his calm voice carried an unquestionable domineering tone. Ji, Tianqing chuckled. If your true body had returned, perhaps you would have the right to say such words. But you've only sent an avatar back, and you want to make a comeback? You underestimate this emperor too much, and overestimate yourself too much. You should know very well that the avatars of the other fellows have already been destroyed by this emperor, and your avatar will meet the same fate. Ji Tianqing's voice wasn't loud, but it was full of energy and confidence, and it spread clearly across the battlefield. Hearing his words, the 10,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were stunned, and their excitement dissipated. Many of them revealed looks of astonishment. It's not the true body of His Majesty the God Emperor, but an avatar. This thought flashed through the minds of the 10,000 soldiers, and they were somewhat disappointed. The 16,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance were also stunned for a moment, and then they breathed a sigh of relief, and their expressions relaxed. It's not the true body, but an avatar? That's good. We still have a chance. End of chapter. Chapter 4174. The arrival of the Azura God Emperor himself and the arrival of his avatar were two completely different concepts. Many God Kings understood that the avatar of the Azura God Emperor only had about 10% of the original strength. Avatars could move freely and were not restricted by distance, making them very convenient to use. The 5 God Emperors would all refine avatars to take the place of their original bodies and handle affairs. Although the avatar only had 10% of the original strength, it was still a bona fide God Emperor, far surpassing the God King realm. Even a peak God King would have no chance of victory against the avatar of the God Emperor. But the current situation was different. Although Ji Tianqing was a peak God King, his true fighting strength had long surpassed the God King realm. In everyone's view, his strength was already very close to the God Emperor realm, and there was not much of a difference between him and the 5 God Emperors. One could well imagine that the avatar of the Azura God Emperor was most likely no match for Ji Tianqing. Thus, the Imperial Tutor's soldiers were somewhat disappointed, their morale low, and their hearts filled with worry. As for the more than 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance, the worry and fear in their hearts dissipated, and they all breathed a sigh of relief. Everyone was filled with anticipation, waiting to see the battle between Ji Tianqing and the avatar of the Azura God Emperor. Everyone had heard that Qin Shin had killed several avatars of the God Emperor before returning to the God realm. But that was only hearsay. No one had seen it with their own eyes, and no one had heard the details of the battle, so they had no idea. But today was different. Everyone present was blessed with the opportunity to witness a battle between supreme gods with their own eyes. How could they not be excited, agitated, and expectant? Seeing everyone's reaction, the avatar of the Azura God Emperor sneered, his eyes full of contempt. Long Tan, in truth, this emperor returned to the boundless heaven continent 50 days ago. Do you know why this emperor waited until today to appear? This sudden sentence caused everyone present to be stunned for a moment. Ji Tianqing also frowned as he stared at the Azura God Emperor's incarnation. Immediately, he guessed something and replied with a sneer, "You returned to the boundless heaven continent 50 days ago, but you didn't dare to make a move against me. It's nothing more than knowing your own limitations and knowing that you're not my match. Therefore, in these 50 days, you used some kind of crooked method to refine your incarnation to become even more powerful. Only then would you have the confidence to deal with me." The external incarnation of an Emperor God expert was like a divine weapon or an item. The avatars could not cultivate or comprehend divine techniques, and their divine power could not be recovered quickly. Therefore, there was no way to increase their battle prowess. However, the Azura God Emperor treated his avatar as a divine tool. He used certain sacrificial techniques to strengthen his avatar and add some power to it. During these 49 days, the Azura God Emperor's incarnation had remained in the depths of the divine palace, refining the blood-soul altar. For this, the Azura God Emperor had spent more than $1 trillion worth of cultivation resources and sacrificed the lives of 98,000 heavenly gods. Those 98,000 heavenly gods were all citizens of the boundless heaven continent. Half of them were Protoss, and the other half were foreign races. As early as half a year ago, the Imperial Tutor had received the Azura God Emperor's message in order to carry out this mission in secret. The Imperial Tutor had sent his most trusted subordinates and generals to various regions to secretly search for suitable targets. Half of the 98,000 heavenly gods to be sacrificed were men and women. 20% of them were boys and 20% of them were old men. In addition, the attributes of these people's divine power, aptitude, and bloodline levels also had corresponding requirements. All in all, it was not easy to find 98,000 qualified sacrificial offerings and to do it secretly without any information being leaked. Only an expert like the Imperial Preceptor, who controlled the entire continent and had immense power, could do it quietly. If it were any other faction, they could not do it secretly. The Azura God Emperor looked down at Ji Tianxing and the Rebel Alliance soldiers and sneered with murderous intent. In these 49 days, 98,000 heavenly gods have completed the sacrifice in the Blood Soul altar, offering their blood souls and power to me. Although this is only one of my incarnations, after the Blood Soul sacrifice, its power has increased by 5 times, and it now has 50% of my strength. Long Tian and those ants behind you. Now, do you understand my good intentions? Ha! Stop resisting stubbornly. Admit defeat and accept this Emperor's judgment. The majestic voice spread throughout the battlefield, and the domineering and majestic aura caused everyone's expression to change. The 10,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command were overjoyed, and their confidence was restored. Their eyes shone brightly. On the other hand, the Rebel Alliance soldiers were frowning, and their faces were solemn and filled with worry. Only Ji Tianxing's expression did not change. He looked at the Azura God Emperor indifferently and said in a cold voice, "It's just a crooked path, and it won't last long. Even if this incarnation has 50% of your strength, so what? I will destroy you today and see how much of your so-called 50% strength is fake." The Azura God Emperor frowned and snorted. He waved his sharp black claws and gave the order to attack. "Kill them all. Leave no one alive." The Azura God Emperor's order sounded a little strange. The 10,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command were at a disadvantage. How could they kill the 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance without leaving a single one alive? It sounded like a fool's dream. However, the Azura God Emperor's incarnation was present, and after the Blood Soul sacrifice, it had 50% of his strength. This gave the 10,000 soldiers great confidence and courage. Hearing the Azura God Emperor's order, the Imperial Tutor led the 10,000 soldiers and bravely launched a charge. Ji Tianxing also waved the Sword of Burial of Heaven and pointed it at the Azura God Emperor and his soldiers. He roared, "Kill!" The 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance immediately roared and waved their swords, and the Kenshin soldiers launched an all-out attack. The fleet led by the God-slaying battleship also released the most violent cannon fire and launched a fierce bombardment at the Azura Divine Palace. This earth-shattering battle, which could be called the grandest and most spectacular in the past 1,000 years, had finally begun. Hundreds of millions of dazzling divine techniques covered tens of thousands of miles of heaven and earth, causing the area to become colorful and chaotic. Tens of thousands of divine techniques bloomed with dazzling light, bursting with destructive power. They fiercely collided between heaven and earth, and the explosion shook the 9 heavens. Peerlessly violent shockwaves, wrapped in endless fragments of divine light, spread out in all directions, destroying everything. In a short moment, everything within 100,000 miles was reduced to a wasteland and ruins. There was only a lonely Azura divine palace left on the battlefield, as well as more than 20,000 soldiers from both sides. They were fighting with their lives on the line. Chapter 4175. On the battlefield, soldiers faced soldiers and generals faced generals. The 15,000 soldiers of the Anti-Rebels League besieged the 10,000 soldiers under Emperor Preceptor's command without any regard for their own safety. The God King experts of the 20 ancient clans and sects engaged in a fierce battle against the 100 or so God Kings under the Imperial Preceptor. Nangong Bohua, clan leader Wenyin, Dugajan, Lan Wuji, Jiang Qian, Su Balian, and the others were all at the 9th level of the God King realm. These 10 clan leaders and sect leaders joined forces to besiege the Imperial Tutor. Ji Tianxing's target was naturally the strongest person present, the Azura God Emperor. Ji Ku, Yin Yao, Ji Wuhan, and the others also fought bravely on the battlefield. They took care of each other and formed battle formations. They advanced and retreated appropriately, constantly killing batch after batch of the Imperial Tutor soldiers. With the protection of a Supreme Grade King Grade Divine artifact, they were invincible. Apart from a peak God King, like the Imperial Tutor, almost no one could do anything to them. However, the Azura God Emperor was entangled by Ji Tianxing, and the Imperial Tutor was held back by the 10 clan leaders and sect leaders. He couldn't spare any time to help. Thus, from the very beginning of this great battle, the situation had been one-sided. The 10,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor were slaughtered. They couldn't break through the encirclement of the rebel alliance at all. They were forced to retreat continuously and could only hide in the Azura Divine Palace. Even so, their numbers were greatly reduced and their morale was getting lower and lower. The fleet led by the god-slaying warships continued to bombard the Azura Divine Palace with their cannons. The Supreme Grade King Grade Divine arrays of the Azura Divine Palace were all activated and operated at full power. With the support of almost endless cultivation resources, the 2 Supreme Grade King Grade Divine arrays could last for at least a few years. However, the continuous bombardment of the 21 god-slaying warships, the aftershocks of the battle, and the fierce attacks of the 10,000 soldiers were still too much for the 2 arrays to bear. After a quarter of an hour of battle, the first layer of the Azura Divine Palace's defensive array formation began to crack. The defensive power of the array formation had clearly declined. After the battle lasted for 45 minutes, about 5,000 of the 10,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command had been killed. Of the 5,000 survivors, they were also severely wounded. They retreated into the Azura Divine Palace, not daring to rush out again. They relied on the defensive array formation of the Azura Divine Palace to tenaciously resist the attacks of the Rebel Alliance, trying to stall for time. With just a few of them, it was impossible for them to win. The Imperial Tutor was also besieged by the 10 clan leaders and clan masters. He was badly wounded and could barely take care of himself. It was impossible for him to turn the situation around. Hence, the 5,000 soldiers placed all their hopes of turning the tables on Emperor God Xiu Luo. At this time, the Shura God Emperor and Ji Tianxing had exchanged tens of thousands of blows in the sky. The heavenly grotto was already riddled with holes and was on the verge of collapse. They had already moved 500,000 miles away from the battlefield. The sky of this 500,000 miles was filled with pitch-black cracks and holes in the void. One could clearly see the stars in the sky. Terrifying void, turbulence, and storms poured into the heavenly grotto from these cracks and holes, wreaking havoc everywhere. The mountains, rivers, and forests within the heavenly grotto were destroyed and annihilated by the void storms. Even though the will of heavenly Tao was slowly repairing the cracks and holes in the void, it could not keep up with the speed of destruction. Therefore, the Azura God Emperor's heavenly grotto would soon shatter and completely disintegrate. As for Ji Tianxing and the Azura God Emperor, they had already left the heavenly grotto and moved to the void. For powerhouses of their realm and level, it was no longer suitable for them to fight in the divine world. No matter where they were in the divine world, as long as they fought with all their strength, the heavens and earth would shatter and space would collapse, creating a great disaster. Only the vast and boundless void was suitable for them to fight. In a void millions of miles away from the divine world, Ji Tianxing and the Azura God Emperor's avatar were facing each other in the void. Separated by tens of thousands of miles, the two stared at each other, locking onto each other's aura, but neither acted rashly. Before this, the two had already exchanged tens of thousands of blows and exhausted a great deal of their divine power. At this time, the two of them were silently adjusting their breathing and treating their injuries. That's right, both of them had suffered heavy injuries. Ji Tianxing's white robe was already tattered and stained with golden blood. His long hair was also disheveled, and there were more than 20 wounds on his body. Half of them were so deep that his bones could be seen. However, he was expressionless, as if he did not feel pain and did not even frown. He held the divine hammer in his left hand, which was surrounded by purple lightning, and the sword of burial of heaven in his right hand. The blade was stained with purple blood and flickered with dark red flames. The purple blood naturally belonged to the Azura God Emperor's avatar. The 10,000 feet tall Azura God Emperor's avatar was also hunched over and panting heavily. His thick and muscular arms, as well as his bulging chest and back, had more than 10 crisscrossing wounds. It was a ghastly sight. 2 of the 6 Azura wings on his back had also been pierced, and purple blood flowed continuously. At this time, he had used a secret skill that temporarily increased his combat strength. His entire body was surrounded by purple flames and a layer of dark red, killing intent. The two of them had fought for so long, and both of them had won and lost. Their injuries were also similar, and neither of them had the upper hand. This result was within Ji Tianxing's expectations, but it was beyond the Azura God Emperor's expectations. His face was ferocious, and his eyes were cold as he stared at Ji Tianxing. He said in a low voice, "Long Tian, how many years has it been since you came back from the dead? Not only have you returned to the peak of the Divine King realm, but you're also several times stronger than before. Such rapid growth is truly unbelievable." Before this, the Azura God Emperor already knew that Ji Tianxing had killed several God Emperor's avatars. After all, these God Emperor's true bodies were in the depths of the void, surrounded by the gray fog. They maintained contact with each other, especially when facing a common enemy like the Kenshin. Naturally, they would exchange information. Therefore, before the Azura God Emperor returned to the divine world, he did not underestimate Ji Tianxing in the slightest. He originally thought that after the Blood Soul sacrifice, his avatar's strength would increase by 4 to 5 times, and he would have the confidence to kill Ji Tianxing. But now, he realized that Ji Tianxing's growth was terrifying. It was obvious that he was several times stronger than before he returned to the divine world. This left the Azura God Emperor with no choice but to consider a question. "Long Tian, I have no choice but to consider this carefully. What kind of treasure in this world could allow you to grow so quickly?" The Azura God Emperor stared coldly at Ji Tianxing, and his lips curled into a meaningful smile. What kind of supreme divine weapon, elixir, or medicine could have such an effect? My guess is that only the heaven-punishing formation, which is on par with the eternal heavenly book, could have such a heaven-defying effect. Ha ha! You may be able to hide it from others, but you cannot hide it from me. The heaven-punishing formation must be in your hands, right? Chapter 4176. To everyone in the world. Supreme quality king level divine artifacts, divine pills, techniques, and materials were the ultimate treasures. Many peak god kings thought so as well. But to the 5 god emperors, they were used to seeing supreme quality king level divine artifacts a long time ago. The eternal heavenly scripture and the heaven punishing formation were divine artifacts that clearly surpassed the god king level and could communicate with and control the power of the heavenly Tao. They were the ultimate treasures they dreamed of. Of course, besides these 2 divine artifacts of unknown origin, there was also the gray mist in the depths of the void, which was fatally attractive to them. At present, the 5 god emperors were most concerned about these 3 things. Apart from these, dynasties, billions of resources, and riches were all just floating clouds. Because at the 5 god emperors' level of strength, they pursued different things. They had long since surpassed the gods and reigned above all living beings. What they pursued was not wealth, power, fame, or status. They wanted to live as long as the heavens, coexist with the heavenly Tao, and even control it. They wanted eternal life, to control the power of the heavenly Tao, to rule the universe and become the most supreme being. The eternal heavenly scripture could only help them surpass the God King level and take that final step into the so-called God Emperor level. It was like a key that helped them open the door to the heavenly Tao, allowing them to step into a new realm and use and control a sliver of the power of the heavenly Tao. But it was very difficult for them to take the next step and become immortal and live as long as the heavens. As for controlling the heavenly Tao, that was even more difficult. Thus, the 5 God Emperors had long ago come to a conclusion. To achieve these goals, they had to find the heaven punishing formation. Either the heaven punishing formation could help them achieve their goals, or the heaven punishing formation and the eternal heavenly scripture could work together. In short, they had to find the heaven punishing formation. But the 5 God Emperors had done everything they could to search the God world and the various star zones, but to no avail. The god of the underworld had even gone to great lengths to support the heaven-punishing race in the lower world and help him search for the heaven-punishing formation. In the end, the 5 God Emperors had failed to obtain the heaven-punishing formation. This was because the heaven punishment formation had always been in Ji Tianxing's hands. Hearing Shura God Emperor's words, Ji Tianxing used the same trick he used against the god of the underworld in the past. His face was full of astonishment, and he asked doubtfully, "Shura, what did you say? The heaven-punishing formation isn't in your hands? You 5 bastards killed me back then, stole the heaven-vanquishing formation, and used the eternal heavenly scripture to break through to the God Emperor realm. Am I wrong?" Ji Tianxing's performance was very realistic. He expressed his astonishment, shock, ecstasy, and relief very subtly. The Azura God Emperor was also stunned for a moment, and he regretted saying the wrong thing. However, his willpower was unyielding, and he quickly regained his composure. He stared at Ji Tianxing and sneered, "Long Tian, stop acting in front of this emperor. You might be able to fool the netherworld with this little trick, but you can't fool this emperor." Clearly, the god of the underworld's clone had a similar conversation with Ji Tianxing. The god of the underworld had also mentioned this to the other god emperors. The god of the underworld had told the other 4 that he had tested the waters and was basically sure that the heaven punishment formation was not in Kenshin's hands. However, the Azura god emperor did not agree, and he still suspected that the heaven punishment formation was in Kenshin's hands. However, he did not have any conclusive evidence, so he could only suspect. And now, he was testing him in person. Unfortunately, Ji Tianxing was already prepared, and he did not reveal any flaws. The Azura God Emperor stared at him and continued to ask, "When you first appeared in the God realm, your identity was first exposed, and it was only a few decades ago. Coincidentally, you were on the Boundless Heaven continent at that time, and you had just recovered to the Divine King realm. In just a few short decades, not only have you recovered to the peak of the Divine King realm, but you are also 8 times stronger than before. Tell me, other than the eternal heavenly book and the heaven punishment formation, what other treasure could have such heaven-defying effects?" If the eternal heavenly book was in the hands of the 5 God Emperors, then there could only be one answer. Ji Tianxing had relied on the heaven punishment formation to create such a miracle. Therefore, the Azura God Emperor did not doubt it. Although this was one of the truths, Ji Tianxing would never admit it. Otherwise, he could not be sure whether the 5 God Emperors would temporarily give up on the mystery of the gray fog and join forces to attack him for the sake of the heaven punishment formation. Given his current strength, if he were to be attacked by the 5 God Emperors again, he would undoubtedly die. "Ha ha ha! Azura, I thought you had taken the heaven punishment formation. Now it seems that you only have the eternal heavenly book. The heavens are indeed fair, and have favored me by not letting you bastards have the formation. The Azura God Emperor frowned and laughed contemptuously. Enough. Long Tian. Do you take me for a fool? Do you still want to keep up the act? Ji Tianxing laughed coldly as well. If you think the heaven punishment formation is in my hands, then what are you waiting for? Why don't you risk your life to take it? Ha ha! If I have the heaven punishment formation, I will soon break through to the God Emperor realm and even surpass you. When that happens, it will be your time to die. Azura, tell the other 4 bastards to wash their necks and wait for death. Before this, the Azura God Emperor had still firmly believed that the heaven punishment formation was in his hands. However, after hearing what he said, Emperor God Xiao Luo hesitated. He frowned and stared at Ji Tianxing, carefully observing Ji Tianxing's eyes and subtle reactions to see if he was lying. Could it be that the heaven punishment formation is really not in your hands? Then where would it be hidden? You were clearly killed by us. So how could you come back from the dead and gain such strength in just a short 100 years? Ji Tianxing pointed at the endless void above his head and said with a playful smile, as the saying goes, the worthy are blessed by the heavens. You are evil spirits who commit all kinds of evil, and the heavens will not tolerate you. But I am the embodiment of justice and light, the representative of the heavens. So the heavens especially favor me. If the heavens don't want me to die, how could I die? Also, only I can swear an oath to the heavens and use it to restrain the powerhouses. You 5 bastards, which one of you can swear an oath on behalf of the heavens? This. The Azura God Emperor hesitated even more, and his face became very ugly. His eyes darted back and forth, and hundreds of thoughts flashed through his mind. He had to admit that Ji Tianxing was favored by the heavens, and it was very likely that he was the favored child of the heavens. It sounded very reasonable. Otherwise, how could he come back from the dead? How could he explain that he could swear an oath to the heavens to restrain the powerhouses of the immortal kings? After all, the Azura God Emperor had long heard that all the domain lords and ancient clan leaders who surrendered and pledged their loyalty to the Kenshin had to swear an oath of surrender. The key was that those long oaths were indeed witnessed and bound by the heavens. The Azura God Emperor had also asked the imperial tutor to collect a few oaths of surrender and personally read the contents of the oaths. That's right, it was an oath to the heavens. Now that he heard Ji Tianxing admitted to his face, the Azura God Emperor's mood became even more complicated. Rather than believe that Ji Tianxing had the heaven punishment formation in his hands, he felt that the seemingly absurd reason of Kenshin is the embodiment of the heavens was more believable. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 4177. The subtle changes in the Azura God Emperor's expression and eyes did not escape Ji Tianxing's notice. He chuckled inwardly as he guessed that the Azura God Emperor had been led to believe the second answer. This way, the suspicion of him possessing the heaven-vanquishing array was lessened. As long as the Azura God Emperor did not have concrete evidence, he could not have incited the other God Emperors to gang up on him and steal the heaven-vanquishing array. While Emperor God Xiaoluo was distracted, Ji Tianxing adjusted his aura and divine power to suppress the injuries in his internal organs. Then he launched another attack. Heavenly Dragon Slash. Ji Tianxing swung the sword of Burial of Heaven with his right hand and unleashed a massive dragon-shaped sword that descended from the sky toward the Azura God Emperor. His left hand swung the hammer and unleashed a barrage of lightning that enveloped the Azura God Emperor for 100 miles before crashing down. The Azura God Emperor immediately regained his composure. Crimson flames erupted from his body as he waved his 2 fawn-like black blades and unleashed a barrage of crimson light. The crimson blades were imbued with boundless killing intent. Not only did they contain the divine power of the 300 laws, but they also contained a wisp of the heavenly Tao. Any other peak God King would have been suppressed by the heavenly Tao, and their strength and reflexes would have decreased. But Ji Tianxing was not affected at all. The heavenly Tao's divine power had no effect on him. This was something he had already verified when he fought with the other God Emperor's avatars. Bam, bam, bam. The divine techniques unleashed by the two clashed fiercely in the void, creating earth-shattering explosions that reverberated through the void. Divine light splashed in all directions as the sword and saber images collapsed. The two were also knocked back 30,000 feet by the powerful recoil. The two unleashed their divine power and clashed 3 more times. Ji Tianxing was finally certain that the avatar of the Azura God Emperor was not as strong as before. It was not that the Azura God Emperor was deliberately hiding his divine power, but that he had expended too much of his energy and his battle prowess was truly declining. With that, Ji Tianxing was relieved. He let out a low roar, and his entire body radiated with dazzling golden light as he used the dragon race's ultimate technique. Celestial Dragon Tyrant Body. In the next moment, he expanded more than 1,000 times in the dazzling golden light, turning into a giant golden armor god that was 10,000 feet tall. His entire body was covered in golden dragon scales, which protected him like a suit of armor. Dragon horns also grew out of his forehead, holy and sharp. His battle prowess also soared, explosively increasing by 8 times. Before this, his strength was slightly lacking compared to the Shura God Emperor's avatar. He had to rely on his perfect sword skills and battle experience to fight the Shura God Emperor to a draw. But now, he was far more powerful than the Shura God Emperor. He had an overwhelming advantage. Most importantly, even if he exhausted all of his divine power in the battle, he could still find a way to escape and replenish his power. As for the Shura God Emperor's avatar, once it ran out of energy, it would be on the verge of collapse. Seeing Ji Tianxing transform into a 10,000-foot tall giant and increase his battle prowess by 8 times, the Shura God Emperor's eyes widened in anger and shock. Damned bastard, you're still hiding your strength? You still have a trump card? In all fairness, Ji Tianxing's battle prowess was already shocking enough. The Shura God Emperor could not believe that a peak divine king could be so powerful. But now, Ji Tianxing's battle prowess had increased by 8 times. Even a Shura God Emperor could guess that this kind of divine power that could temporarily increase one's battle prowess would not last long. Perhaps it would even have serious side effects. But the fact that Ji Tianxing could wait until now to use this move was beyond his expectations. After all, Ji Tianxing's battle prowess had already surpassed his avatar's. In other words, Ji Tianxing could already erupt with 60 to 70% of his original strength. A peak divine king could actually erupt with 60 to 70% of a God Emperor's strength. How frightening was this? The Shura God Emperor's heart was filled with worry. He had to consider a question. Given Long Tian's astonishing rate of growth, wouldn't he be able to break through to the God Emperor realm in a few more decades? The 5 God Emperors were well aware that the God Emperor realm was not something that could be broken through by relying on talent and opportunity. There were already 5 God Emperors in this world, and it was basically impossible for a 6th God Emperor to appear. If a 6th God Emperor were to appear in the future, it would definitely be Long Tian. After all, Long Tian's talent and comprehension were superb, and he was also a lucky fellow blessed by the heavens. The God Emperor realm required one to comprehend and control the power of the heavenly Tao. For a lucky fellow like Long Tian, it was the same as cheating. No, after today, this God Emperor must convince the other 4 to get rid of Long Tian no matter what. As long as this calamity is not eliminated, we will not be able to rest in peace. This thought flashed through the Shura God Emperor's mind, and he resolved to get rid of Ji Tianxing as soon as possible. At this time, Ji Tianxing once again brandished the Burial of Heaven and the Divine Hammer, launching a ferocious attack. Sword Rain, Heaven-splitting sword. The Burial of Heaven pointed the sword into the depths of the void, and 90,000 stars lit up in the firmament and fell like a meteor shower. This sword divine ability was very powerful, but there was a slight delay after it was released. To deal with an expert like the Shura God Emperor, it could only be used when he was unprepared. If the Shura God Emperor was prepared, he would have teleported tens of thousands of kilometers away before the sword rain fell. As for the other move, Heaven-Splitting Sword, it was not executed with the Burial of Heaven, but with the Divine Hammer. At Ji Tianxing's level, no matter what kind of weapon he used, it would not affect his ability to use divine techniques. Not to mention the Divine Hammer. Even if he was barehanded, he could still use this sword divine ability. A moment later, the Shura God Emperor, who was filled with worry and anxiety, finally came to his senses. He felt the invisible sword intent of the heavens envelop him, as if the heavens were angry and the heavenly Tao was punishing him. He immediately realized that something was wrong. He did not even look up at the sky, but teleported backward and retreated. Apart from Ji Tianxing, no other God King could teleport through the void because they did not have the power of space to use and control it. But a God Emperor could do it. After all, a God Emperor could borrow the power of the heavenly Tao. As for why Ji Tianxing could teleport through the void, it was probably because of this. It was just that he could not sense the power of the heavenly Tao, so he could not comprehend it or use it. He could not even obtain the heavenly Tao merit. Whoosh! In the blink of an eye, the Shura God Emperor had teleported 30,000 kilometers away. Originally, he had already escaped the range of the sword rain, but the 90,000 stellar swords had long since locked onto his aura. No matter where he fled, they would follow him. Thus, the 90,000 stellar swords turned around and charged at the Shura God Emperor. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The sword light whistled past with incredible speed, catching up to the Shura God Emperor in the blink of an eye and drowning him. Bam, bam, bam. Then, the tens of thousands of stellar swords slammed into the Shura God Emperor, creating a series of dull booms. Chapter 4178. Following a series of muffled sounds, countless fragments of starlight scattered across the void. The Azura God Emperor knew that he couldn't escape the sword rain, so he used all his strength to form a blood flame shield to protect himself. The 6 broad, blood-red wings on his back also wrapped around his body tightly. At the same time, he released a surge of divine energy, forming thousands of blood-red blades that circled around his body to form a defensive barrier. With these 3 layers of protection, he was confident that he could withstand the sword rain. Bang, 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 bang. Tens of thousands of stellar swords struck the Azura God Emperor one after another, but they were all blocked by the blood-red blade's barrier. The blood-red blade barrier shook violently under the onslaught of the stellar swords, and cracks began to appear on its surface. However, the stellar swords were also shattered, scattering countless fragments of starlight. A total of 15,000 stellar swords were shattered by the blade barrier and dissipated into the void. However, the sharp blade barrier was also completely destroyed and disintegrated on the spot. The Azura God Emperor's first line of defense was destroyed by the stellar swords. In the next moment, tens of thousands of stellar swords struck the Azura God Emperor's blood-red shield one after another. This oval-shaped blood-red shield was 10,000 feet tall and 3 inches thick. A thick blood-red color swirled around it, and flames soared into the sky. Bang, bang, bang. Muffled sounds rang out one after another, interspersed with kacha-kacha sounds. That was the sound of the starry great sword being shattered after hitting the bloodlight shield with all its might. Of course, there were also sounds of cracks appearing on the blood-red shield. This time, 25,000 starry swords were consumed before the bloody shield was broken and disintegrated. The Azura God Emperor's second line of defense was also destroyed by the stellar swords. At this point, the Azura God Emperor only had one last line of defense left, and that was his 6 Azura wings that wrapped around his body. Of the 90,000 stellar swords, 40,000 had been used. Only 50,000 remained. The Shura God Emperor's heart was filled with anger and shock. He didn't expect Ji Tianxing's sword arts to be so complex and powerful. Those tens of thousands of starry swords seemed to have intelligence and intelligence. After the first 40,000 great star swords dissipated, the remaining 50,000 great star swords formed a sword formation and attacked him one after another. Swish! Swish! The starry swords flew back and forth in the void, interweaving into a sword formation that had a radius of 1,000 miles. They kept a special rhythm and frequency, attacking continuously. Pung, pung, pung. The great star sword slammed into the Azura God Emperor's blood-colored wings, creating a series of muffled sounds that reverberated endlessly in the void. The Azura God Emperor's body trembled from the bombardment, and his blood-red wings flashed with a dark red light. Even though the Azura God Emperor did his best to circulate his divine energy, flapping his wings to launch a counterattack, he managed to shatter many of the stellar swords. However, 2 of his wings were injured and had been pierced through earlier. Now, under the onslaught of the great star swords, those 2 wings were quickly cut into pieces. The heart-wrenching pain caused the Azura God Emperor to fly into a rage, his eyes filled with blood-red flames. Bastard! Long Tian, this emperor will tear you to pieces. The Azura God Emperor swung his blood-red blades with all his might, blocking the incoming great star swords from all directions. However, there were too many of them. Even though he could destroy dozens of great star swords in a breath's time, he was still hit by more. After 10 breaths, all 50,000 great star swords collapsed, dissipated, or ran out of energy. The dazzling net of great star swords disappeared, and the Azura God Emperor finally breathed a sigh of relief. However, his injuries were even more severe, and he looked even more battered. In addition to the 2 destroyed wings, 2 more had been pierced through, leaving behind several bloody wounds. His chest and back also had several new wounds, from which purple blood continuously flowed out. He panted heavily, circulating his energy to suppress his injuries, but his combat strength was also declining. Ji Tianxing, on the other hand, was unscathed. His golden body showed no signs of injury, and his strength was also at its peak. The Azura God Emperor stared coldly at him, thinking to himself, even if you use a forbidden secret technique to increase your combat strength by 8 times, it's destined that you won't be able to maintain it for long. As long as this emperor can hold on for another 15 minutes, your combat strength will decline and you will suffer a backlash from a secret technique, and your time of death will come. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Ji Tianxing launched another attack. Starry River Break. Ji Tianxing first swung his divine hammer, slashing out a great star sword over 10,000 feet long, slashing towards the Azura God Emperor's head. This great star sword was formed by the convergence of the endless power of the stars. There were hundreds of millions of stars in the void, which could provide endless power of the stars. In addition, the 90,000 great star swords had just dissipated, and the surrounding void was filled with a rich amount of star power. Therefore, this divine power, Starry River Break, was the most suitable one. Seeing the great star sword slashing down, the Azura God Emperor remained calm. He waved the nameless blade with both hands, sending out crimson blade auras. Bang, bang, bang. Ka, ka, ka. Dozens of crimson blade auras clashed with the great star sword, creating a series of muffled booms and shattering sounds. In the blink of an eye, the great star sword was pulverized, and the dozens of crimson blade auras were also disintegrated. The Azura God Emperor had just neutralized Ji Tianxing's attack when another great star sword came crashing down with terrifying divine power. Sword of World Annihilation. Without a doubt, this was a secret technique that Ji Tianxing had used after absorbing a vast amount of 5 elemental world energy. This sword was filled with an indomitable, unstoppable, and unstoppable aura, and it really did have the power to destroy the world. As the great star sword came crashing down, even the pitch-black void started to ripple, creating layers of ripples. The Azura God Emperor's aura was locked onto by the great star sword, and he found it difficult to breathe and even felt a trace of fear in his heart. This is the power of the world? He sensed that the great star sword's aura was special, and only after carefully sensing it did he realize what it was. His face immediately turned ugly. Despicable guy. He hasn't even broken through to the God Emperor stage, but he has already mastered a special power that is not inferior to the power of the heavenly Tao. Even the five of us can't refine the divine realm or use the power of the world. How did he do it? To be honest, the Azura God Emperor was already feeling a little jealous of Ji Tianqing. Although he didn't know how many miraculous encounters Ji Tianqing had, or how many opportunities and treasures he had obtained, he knew that Ji Tianqing was one of them. This guy must be the chosen one, the lucky one blessed by the heavens. Otherwise, how could a person be so lucky? As these thoughts flashed through his mind, the Azura God Emperor had no choice but to teleport away to avoid the Sword of World Annihilation. However, he was locked onto by the Sword of World Annihilation, and his strength was suppressed, so he couldn't escape fast enough. He had just teleported 20,000 kilometers away when the Sword of World Annihilation caught up to him and struck him. Chapter 4179. Kaboom! The 10,000 zhang long world exterminating sword hit Emperor God Xiao Luo, and there was a loud bang. Fortunately, he knew that he couldn't dodge this attack, so he formed a divine power shield in time and raised the two blades above his head. The World Destroyer sword slashed down and struck the two top-grade king, level nameless blades first. With two loud bangs, the two blades buzzed violently and were sent flying, falling into the void 100 miles away. Then, the power of World Destroyer sword didn't decrease, and it hit Emperor God Xiao Luo's divine power shield. With a loud, cracking sound, the blood-red shield was smashed into pieces on the spot, and countless blood-red fragments splashed out. The Azura God Emperor let out a painful groan as he was sent flying hundreds of miles away. While he was still flying, a long trail of purple blood spilled behind him. When he fell into the void 100 miles away, he could clearly see that his left shoulder had almost been cut off. There was a huge wound that split his left shoulder bone in half, leaving only a few thin bones and a few tendons connected to his arm and shoulder. Neatly broken bones could be seen in the hideous wound, and blood gushed out like a fountain. This was the worst injury the Azura God Emperor had suffered since the start of their battle. The pain in his body was nothing, but the deep sense of humiliation and defeat made his body tremble in anger. His entire body was surrounded by bloody flames that soared into the sky. But he didn't roar or shout, and he didn't say anything, because he knew very well that he couldn't beat Ji Tianqing, so no matter what he said, he would only be humiliating himself. A moment later, he suppressed his anger and calmed himself down. A thought flashed through his mind, and he changed his attitude. This is the first time he has used this divine ability since I started fighting with him. From the looks of it, this divine ability should be his trump card, his ultimate secret technique. He used a forbidden technique to increase his combat strength by 8 times in a short time, but it will be over soon. That's why he was so anxious and didn't hold anything back. He just wanted to end the battle as soon as possible. If that's the case, I just need to buy some time until his forbidden technique is over. When his strength declines and he suffers a backlash, won't he be at my mercy? With this thought, the Azura God Emperor was no longer anxious or angry. He reached out and picked up the two blades that fell hundreds of miles away, and hurriedly circulated his energy to suppress his injuries. Ji Tianqing wasn't in a hurry to attack, and he wasn't in a hurry either. He was happy to buy time. But unfortunately, Ji Tianqing only paused for 2 breaths of time before attacking again. Emperor God Xiao Luo changed his mind and decided to avoid fighting with Ji Tianqing head-on. Instead, he tried to stall him. He wanted to wait until Ji Tianqing's strength declined and counterattack. This move was indeed effective. Although the Azura God Emperor couldn't avoid all of Ji Tianqing's attacks, he did slow down Ji Tianqing's attack frequency and delay Ji Tianqing's rhythm. Time slowly passed. Before he knew it, 15 minutes had passed. In this 15 minutes, Ji Tianqing attacked over 1,000 times, using countless divine powers and consummate skills. The Azura God Emperor only dodged, circled, and fought, refusing to face Ji Tianqing head-on. Even when Ji Tianqing mocked and taunted him, he turned a deaf ear and suppressed his anger. After 15 minutes of fighting, Ji Tianqing's condition didn't change much. But the Azura God Emperor's injuries were even worse. There were over 100 wounds all over his body, all of them dyed purple with blood. His strength was also steadily declining, and he was getting weaker and weaker. After a quarter of an hour had passed, he became suspicious and vigilant. He was a little anxious. What puzzled him was that he estimated that Ji Tianxing's transformation state would last 15 minutes at most, and his strength would begin to decline. But Ji Tianxing was still calm and composed, showing no signs of weakening, not to mention the backlash from the secret technique. What made him even more wary was that Ji Tianxing's strength didn't decline, but he only had 60% of his strength left. He didn't dare to delay any longer. Once his strength fell to 30%, it would be very difficult to escape Ji Tianxing's pursuit. And once his strength was exhausted, this incarnation would also be destroyed. Damn it, what kind of secret technique did he use to last so long? The Azura God Emperor stared at Ji Tianxing, wishing he could see through him. He was a knowledgeable person, but he had never seen a secret technique that could increase one's combat strength by 8 times and maintain it for so long. This was too heaven-defying. No, I can't be sure when his strength will decline. I can't just keep dodging and fighting. I have to counterattack to last longer. The Azura God Emperor changed his mind again. Seeing Ji Tianxing charging at him, he began a counterattack. The two of them began to fight fiercely in the void, their figures flashing and shuttling in the darkness. In the dark void, a deafening explosion erupted, and a dazzling divine light flashed. The area around the two of them was illuminated by the divine light, dazzling everything within tens of thousands of miles. Just like that, another 30 minutes passed. The Azura God Emperor's injuries were getting worse and worse. All 6 of his wings had been pierced, and many holes had been torn open. There was almost no place on his body that was intact. There were at least 100 wounds, so deep that bones were exposed, and blood was constantly flowing out. With such serious injuries, his strength had fallen to about 50%, and he was clearly feeling very weak. At this time, Ji Tianxing's dragon transformation state was still not over. Even though he had used up a lot of energy, and his fighting strength had decreased slightly, compared to the Azura God Emperor, he was still full of energy and calm. The Azura God Emperor couldn't understand at all. He was angry, shocked, and jealous. It was already a miracle that a secret skill that could increase one's fighting strength by 8 times could last for 15 minutes. However, Ji Tianxing had lasted for 45 minutes, and there was no sign of him fading. This was absolutely unprecedented. Unprecedented. If it were any other expert who could master such a divine ability, they would be able to challenge and kill enemies above their level. This was too heaven-defying. The Azura God Emperor was very jealous. He couldn't help but think that if he could master this secret skill, not only would he be able to easily kill Long Tian, the other 4 God Emperor wouldn't be his match. At that time, he would definitely find the right time to eliminate the 4 of them one by one and monopolize the gray fog and the myriad worlds. No, I can't drag this out any longer. Once my strength falls below 50%, it will be very dangerous. The only thing I could do now is to retreat. Emperor God Xiao Luo had such a thought. He felt his face burning, and he felt extremely ashamed. Before this, he had never thought that as the supreme God Emperor, there would be a day when he was forced to run away from an enemy. This was too shameful, too humiliating. Chapter 4180. The Azura God Emperor had already made up his mind to escape. As for the Azura Divine Palace, the Imperial Tutor, and the thousands of soldiers, he could no longer care about them. At worst, the Rebel Alliance would win, and the entire Boundless Heaven continent would be occupied by Ji Tianxing, and he would bear the humiliation of not being able to defeat Kenshin and running away, and become the laughingstock of the Boundless Heaven continent, and even the entire God realm. Shame. It was indeed very shameful. But this incarnation could be preserved and would not be destroyed on the spot by Ji Tianxing. Even if the Boundless Heaven continent was occupied by Ji Tianxing, it was only temporary. After he dealt with the gray fog mystery, His original body could kill his way back to the God realm at any time and take back the boundless heaven continent. But today, he fought Ji Tianxing to the end, and most likely he would collapse here. The fact that the boundless heaven continent was occupied and he became the laughingstock of the God realm would not change at all. In contrast, he would lose an incarnation, and more than 100 years of hard work would go up in smoke. Even though the Azura God Emperor had already made up his mind. But he did not reveal any clues on the surface to avoid being detected and seen through by Ji Tianxing. After he exchanged 2 more moves with Ji Tianxing, he took advantage of the moment when he was forced back by Ji Tianxing's sword and decisively teleported 30,000 miles away, fleeing into the depths of the void. Whoosh! With a flash of light, the Azura God Emperor left the battle circle and appeared 30,000 miles away, flying away without looking back. His figure flickered repeatedly in the void, crossing 20,000 miles every time he flickered. His speed was extremely fast. Seeing this scene, Ji Tianxing was also stunned for a moment, and a trace of astonishment flashed in his eyes. Although he also guessed that the Azura God Emperor's strength was not enough, he would definitely not sit still and wait for death, and would most likely escape. But he did not expect the Azura God Emperor to be so cautious and flee so decisively. He thought that the Azura God Emperor would flee when he was even weaker, when he only had 40% or 30% of his strength left. Who would have thought that the Azura God Emperor would flee when he only had 50% of his strength left? TSK. You gave up on the Imperial Tutor and his soldiers so easily and turned around to escape without any hesitation. Do you not care about your reputation at all? Aren't you afraid of being ridiculed by the world and becoming the laughingstock of the God realm? Ji Tianxing chased after the Azura God Emperor with the burial of Heaven Sword and Godly Hammer in hand. The Azura God Emperor was 50,000 kilometers ahead of him. However, he was stronger and in a better state. His speed was also faster. The two of them were like 2 resplendent specks of light. One was blood red, the other dark gold. They chased and leaped about in the void. In just 10 breaths of time, the distance between the two of them had shrunk to about 10,000 miles. To the two of them, a distance of 10,000 miles was already very close. They could exchange blows and kill each other. Ji Tianxing decisively swung his godly hammer and sword of burial of heaven and launched a fierce attack on the Azura God Emperor. The Azura God Emperor did not want to fight him head-on. He did not want to be entangled with him and lose the opportunity to escape. Thus, he only cast spells to block Ji Tianxing's attacks and minimize the damage to himself. Most of his strength was still used to escape. Bam, bam, bam. After a series of dull thuds, the Azura God Emperor's body flashed with divine light and blood splattered everywhere. His divine power shield had been broken, and his injuries had worsened. His strength was also gradually weakening. However, at the cost of his injuries, he successfully evaded Ji Tianxing's attacks and continued to flee into the depths of the void. As he fled, Ji Tianxing continued to taunt and provoke the Azura God Emperor. He hoped to provoke him and make him stop and fight to the end. However, the Azura God Emperor saw through his intentions. No matter how much he taunted, the Azura God Emperor turned a deaf ear and continued to flee. At the same time, the Azura God Emperor was secretly calculating the time, praying that Ji Tianxing's transformation would end as soon as possible. If Ji Tianxing returned to normal and suffered a backlash from the secret technique, his strength would decline, and he would be in an extremely weak state. The Azura God Emperor would stop running and turn around to kill Ji Tianxing. He had been waiting for this opportunity. However, the duration of Ji Tianxing's transformation had far exceeded his expectations. He could not tell when Ji Tianxing would return to normal. He also could not guarantee that when Ji Tianxing returned to normal, he would be seriously injured and whether he would still have the strength to kill Ji Tianxing. As time passed, Ji Tianxing and the Azura God Emperor continued to fly through the void, getting further and further away from the God realm. After another quarter of an hour, the two had traveled 3 million li in the void. At this point, Ji Tianqing's celestial dragon tyrant body finally ended. His body shrunk back to its normal size, and his super strong combat strength also returned to normal. The Azura God Emperor, who was flying in front, saw that Ji Tianqing had finally returned to normal and heaved a sigh of relief. The pressure on him was greatly reduced. Phew! That damn guy, he actually maintained it for an hour before it ended. Such a powerful secret technique is rare in the world, one of a kind. Once I kill him, I will refine his soul and memories and take this secret technique for myself. With this in mind, the Azura God Emperor continued to maintain his speed while observing Ji Tianqing's reaction. He was looking forward to seeing how pitiful Ji Tianqing would be when the secret technique backfired on him and his strength rapidly weakened, or even when he was heavily injured. At that time, he would have the chance to take revenge and kill Ji Tianqing as he wished. However, Emperor God Xiao Luo thought again and felt that something was amiss. Long Tian should be very clear that this kind of secret technique that increases one's combat strength for a short period of time will definitely have serious repercussions. Now that the secret technique has ended, if he does not want to be killed by me when the secret technique backfires, he should have given up on chasing me and turned to run. But he does not seem to have any intention of running away. He is still chasing after me. Thinking of this, the Azura God Emperor felt a sense of unease and fear. Could it be that after using this secret technique, he will not suffer a backlash? That's impossible. All secret techniques that can temporarily increase one's combat strength will overdraft one's strength and potential, resulting in serious consequences. This is in line with the principles of the heavenly Tao. The Azura God Emperor could not believe that Ji Tianqing was safe and sound. But on second thought, this guy was the heaven's chosen child who was blessed by the heavens. What heavenly Tao's rule? Heaven's chosen child should not be affected by it, right? Thinking of this, the Azura God Emperor's face changed, and his eyes flashed with anxiety and anger. Damn it, this emperor couldn't have guessed correctly, right? He sped up and fled into the depths of the void while paying close attention to Ji Tianqing's situation. In the end, Ji Tianqing chased him for another 1,000,000 miles and injured him 3 times, but there was still no sign of the secret technique backfiring on him. This confirmed the Azura God Emperor's conjecture, and at the same time, he felt a deep sense of anger, jealousy, and despair. A secret technique that can increase one's combat strength by 8 times and last for an hour without any repercussions. How can such a heaven-defying secret technique exist in this world and be obtained by Long Tian? The heavens are so unfair. Chapter 4181. To say that the heavens were too unfair to a lucky person who had been blessed by the heavens was somewhat helpless. The Azura God Emperor was indeed at his wit's end against Ji Tianqing. Even after Ji Tianqing's transformation had ended and he had returned to his normal state, he was still full of energy and divine power, not at all weakened or fatigued. Compared to Emperor God Xiao Luo, who was severely injured, his power was still very strong. Helpless, the Azura God Emperor could only continue to flee. His hope of killing Ji Tianqing had been dashed, and he no longer dared to hope for anything more. He would be satisfied if he could escape safely. However, such a small wish was very difficult to realize. The two chased each other through the void for another hour. Ji Tianqing was in a constant state of pursuit, catching up to the Azura God Emperor every once in a while and using his ultimate skills to beat him into a corner, worsening his injuries. On the other hand, the Azura God Emperor was in a constant state of flight, constantly being attacked by Ji Tianqing's various divine abilities and secret arts. He was exhausted from parrying and dodging. If he had stopped and resisted with all his might, he would not have been so badly injured. But even if he had stopped to fight Ji Tianqing, he was still no match for Ji Tianqing, and there was no way he could have turned tables. In the end, he would have run out of energy and died in the void. Therefore, he was also very helpless to fall into such a passive and embarrassing situation. He had no way to turn the situation around. As long as no miracle occurred, and no other God Emperor's avatar came to the Azura God Emperor's aid, The result of this battle was actually already decided. Even if he gritted his teeth and endured for 4 hours, running for 30 million li, it was useless. In the end, Emperor God Xiao Luo's embodiment was destroyed by Ji Tianxing in the void after it was severely injured and its power was exhausted. Then it dissipated. Unfortunately, this was only an avatar. After being killed by Ji Tianxing, it did not leave behind any precious treasures. There were only 2 top-grade king-grade fangs, a spatial ring, and a tattered set of armor. Moreover, the 2 fangs had been cracked and chipped by Ji Tianxing in the previous battle. Fortunately, the fangs and armor were both top-grade king-grade divine artifacts. Even if they could not be used anymore, the materials were still very precious. After picking up the 3 spoils, Ji Tianxing threw the 2 fangs and the armor to the heaven-mending orb to devour. Only the spatial ring was left, and he kept it. After the battle ended, the void regained its tranquility and became pitch black again. Ji Tianxing turned around and flew towards the divine world, flying towards the gap in the Azura paradise. After flying at full speed for 3 hours, he returned to the gap in the Azura paradise. At this time, the Azura paradise had been completely destroyed. It was on the verge of collapse and disintegration. Even the power of the heavens would not be able to repair the huge cracks and holes in the void. Ji Tianxing passed through the huge crack in the void and returned to the shattered Azura paradise. As far as the eye could see, the scene in the grotto heaven had undergone a drastic change compared to a few hours ago. The green mountains, the endless forests, and the mountains had all disappeared under the ravages of the void storm. Everything within a few 100,000 miles had been eroded and occupied by the void, turning it into an endless darkness. Ji Tianxing passed through the dark void and returned to the depths of the paradise, where the Azura Divine Palace was located. He saw that the battle had already ended. The magnificent and majestic Azura Divine Palace's defensive array had long been breached. Under the attacks of countless powerhouses, it had been reduced to ruins. The remnants of the broken bricks and broken walls, as well as the rising flames and black smoke, were still telling the story of the tragic battle. The shattered defensive array only had a few foundations buried in the ruins. The dark red walls of light still flickered with a faint blood-red light. Fragments of weapons and armors could be seen everywhere in the ruins, as well as some corpses of divine monarchs. The thousands of soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command had disappeared. The 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance and the 20 divine warships had also disappeared. Ji Tianxing carefully observed again and discovered that this battlefield had also been simply cleaned up. At the very least, the spatial rings and other spoils of war of the Imperial Tutor soldiers had been collected. The corpses of the dead soldiers of the Rebel Alliance had also been collected. It has been almost 10 hours since I left the Azura Paradise to pursue the Azura God Emperor. The battle here should have ended 4 hours ago. Yao Yao, Cuckoo, and the others must have led the soldiers out of the Azura Paradise to recuperate outside. Previously, Ji Tianxing had left the Azura Paradise alone to deal with the Azura God Emperor. Yin Yao, Ji Ku, and the others had stayed behind to help the Rebel Alliance's army. Even if Ji Tianxing was not present, Nangong Buhua, as the Deputy Alliance leader, would make the right choice in time and give the appropriate orders. In addition, if Nangong Buhua could not make up his mind, he would definitely ask for Yun Yao and Ji Ku's opinion. Ji Tianxing was not worried about this at all. Therefore, he looked up at the collapsed Azura Paradise and the ruins that were quickly being swallowed by the void storm. Then, he turned and flew out. He was certain that the Azura Paradise could not be saved. After today, it would disappear and be removed from the boundless heaven continent. The Azura God Emperor's avatar had also been destroyed. The Azura God Emperor would not be able to do anything in the short term. In other words, the Rebel Alliance had won a complete victory. The boundless heaven continent was under Ji Tianxing's rule. This situation would not change for the next few decades. The situation was just as Ji Tianxing had predicted. When he left the Azura Paradise, he saw 21 divine warships floating in the vast sea of clouds outside. Those divine warships maintained their formation, lined up neatly, and waited quietly. The disciples of the various clans and sects had returned to their respective divine worships. They were probably recuperating and healing. Those 20 divine warships were covered in scars. They kept flickering with divine light, and their power was somewhat unstable. Each clan had sent out a few God-King experts to cast spells to deal with the scars and gaps on the divine warships. As for the God-slaying warship in the lead, it was naturally intact. There were only a few scars and scratches on it. Ji Tianxing returned to the God-slaying warship and spread out his divine sense. He was clear of everyone's movements. The white dragon was in the control room. He was busy studying various array formations and repairing some of the scars on the divine warship. Yin Yao, Ji Ku, and the others had returned to the distorted space-time of the Nine Heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda to heal their injuries. Ji Tianxing entered the distorted space-time to check on everyone's situation. He was truly relieved when he saw that although everyone's injuries were not light, their lives were not in danger. Chapter 4182. The meeting room was extremely spacious. The 20 clan leaders and sect leaders only took 100 breaths to gather here. Everyone's gaze was focused on Ji Tianxing, who was sitting at the head of the table. They all looked excited and expectant as they waited for Ji Tianxing to announce the answer. This was because everyone was very concerned about one question. Did the Alliance leader defeat the Shura God Emperor's clone? This was an extremely important question. Everyone could not wait to know the answer. Ji Tianxing originally wanted to ask everyone about the situation in the Shura Grotto Heaven. However, when he saw how excited and expectant everyone was, he guessed what they were thinking. Before he could speak, Nangong Buhua stood up and cupped his fists. He smiled and said, "Alliance leader, the battle with the Imperial Tutor ended 4 hours ago. During these 4 hours, while everyone was recuperating, they were also very concerned about your safety. Now that you have returned safely, everyone can be at ease. However, everyone still wants to know what happened to the Shura God Emperor's clone." As soon as Nangong Buhua finished speaking, the clan leaders and sect leaders nodded and agreed. There were also 2 clan leaders who were good at flattering. They immediately took the opportunity to flatter Ji Tianxing. "Vice Alliance leader Nangong, do you still need to ask? Since the Alliance leader has returned safely, the Shura God Emperor's clone must have been defeated." "That's right. Do you know how wise and powerful the Alliance leader is? If the Shura God Emperor's original body is here, he can still fight with the Alliance leader. It's just a clone. He must have been beaten to a pulp by the Alliance leader. It's too horrible to look at." Although they were flattering, their words were not too exaggerated and did not make people feel disgusted. Instead, everyone smiled knowingly. Ji Tianxing nodded slightly. After everyone quieted down, he said, "Before returning to the divine world, I killed several God Emperor's clones in the void outside the divine world. Although the incarnation of the Azura God Emperor had been sacrificed by 99,000 people, it had gained great power. However, evil can never triumph over good. In the end, he was no match for me. I've already killed him in the void and turned him into ashes." Hearing this result, everyone present was stunned for a moment. Soon after, they revealed an expression of disbelief and cheered in surprise. "You actually killed the incarnation of the Azura God Emperor? Oh my God, isn't Lord Alliance Chief's strength a little too powerful? We thought that you would only be able to defeat him and allow him to escape in the end. Who would have thought that he would be so powerful? The Azura God Emperor's avatar had 50% of his original strength, but he was still killed by the Alliance Master. Doesn't this mean that Lord Alliance Leader's true strength is not far from that of the Azura God Emperor? Ha! Although Lord Alliance Chief is a peak divine king, he has strength comparable to the God Emperor. Simply inconceivable. In the past 1,000 years, we have all heard of Lord Alliance Chief's various legends and miracles. Now, we have followed Lord Alliance Chief and witnessed you create another miracle with our own eyes. We have won. The boundless heaven continent is ours. That's right. We have won. We have won a complete victory. We have won beautifully. Lord Alliance Chief is so mighty. The patriarchs and sect masters who were usually high and mighty no longer cared about being reserved. They all cheered and discussed excitedly. Their faces were full of smiles, and their eyes shone brightly with excitement. After all, they had taken a great risk and followed the Rebel Alliance to fight all over the world. They had paid a great price. Now that they had finally won, their efforts were worth it. Ji Tianxing raised his hand and motioned for everyone to quiet down. He then asked, Deputy Alliance Chief Nangong, please report the results of the battle at the Azura Grotto Heaven. Nangong Buhua hurriedly stood up and bowed. With a solemn expression, he reported, Reporting to Lord Alliance Master, we didn't let you down. We successfully broke into the Azura Divine Palace and destroyed the army under the Imperial Preceptor. All the soldiers under the Imperial Tutor, regardless of whether they were God Monarchs or God Kings, were killed. No one was left alive. Even the Imperial Tutor was besieged by us. In the end, his body was smashed into pieces and he died on the spot. In this battle, the Alliance's soldiers had also paid a great price. A total of 4,000 soldiers were sacrificed. Of the 12,000 survivors, they were either lightly or heavily injured. There were also 20 divine warships that suffered varying degrees of damage. It will take a long time for them to recover. However, at such a price, we have destroyed the Azura Divine Palace and destroyed the Imperial Tutor's army. It can be considered a complete victory. Nangong Buhua paused for a moment. He, the patriarchs, and the patriarchs all wore proud looks on their faces, as well as gratified looks. Before this, the people of the boundless heaven continent only knew that the Kenshin was unparalleled and domineering. The Rebel Alliance had been invincible and had won successive battles because of the Kenshin's reputation and strength. However, in this battle, the patriarchs and sect had used facts to prove that they were not weak. They had enough strength to defeat their opponents. They had won with their own abilities. They had not let down the Kenshin's trust and high regard. Ji Tianxing revealed a satisfied smile and nodded. Everyone, you have worked hard. Well done. Today's battle was won so smoothly because of everyone's efforts. I have already said that after saving the people of the world and occupying the boundless heaven continent, everyone will be rewarded according to their performance. I will begin this matter in a moment. Hearing the words reward according to their performance, the patriarchs and sect masters' eyes lit up. They were even more eager and eager. At this time, Nangong Buhua continued to report. Reporting to Lord Alliance Leader, after the battle ended, the Alliance seized all the spoils of war and collected the remains and belongings of the soldiers. Seeing that the Azura Paradise was on the verge of collapse and was about to be swallowed by the void, we emptied the Azura Divine Palace's treasury and retreated from the Azura Paradise to wait for your return. We are still counting the spoils of war. Once we are done, I will personally present them to you. Ji Tianxing knew that the Imperial Tutor and his 10,000 soldiers were all very rich. They controlled a huge amount of resources and wealth. In particular, the Azura Divine Palace's treasury must contain inestimable resources and wealth. At the very least, there were resources worth tens of trillions of dollars. At the very least, even if there were resources worth tens of trillions of dollars, more than Ji Tianxing's entire net worth, he would not be surprised. After all, the Azura God Emperor had controlled the boundless heaven continent for more than 1,000 years and had been greedily seizing cultivation resources. Ji Tianxing nodded in agreement and said to everyone, rest and recuperate for a few days. After everything is over, I will gather everyone for a meeting. Chapter 4183. Logically speaking, after the war ended, the people of the various clans and sects would naturally return to their grotto heavens to recuperate. However, the grotto heavens of these 20 clans and sects were distributed in various regions of the boundless heaven continent and were very far away from each other. Once they were separated, it would take another month to gather again. Since that was the case, they might as well wait outside the Azura Grotto Heaven for a few days. After the follow-up matters were settled, it would not be too late to return to their respective grotto heavens. In any case, the boundless heaven continent had already been conquered by the Rebel Alliance. The 20 clans and sects had already completed their mission, so they were not in a hurry to return to recuperate. They would rather wait a few more days for Ji Tianxing to reward them according to their merits, then return home in glory. In the next few days, everyone stayed in the divine warship to recuperate. Ji Tianxing also suffered serious injuries, so he entered the distorted space-time of the divine pagoda to recuperate in seclusion for a period of time. For days had passed in the outside world, and he had been recuperating in the distorted space-time for 200 days. His injuries were basically stable, and there were no major problems. If he wanted to fully recover from his injuries, it would not be a matter of 1 or 2 years. He would have to recuperate for at least 10 years. After all, when the Azura God Emperor's incarnation fought with him, most of the injuries caused to him were Tao injuries. Compared to ordinary injuries, Tao injuries were even more difficult to recover from. Ji Tianxing ended his seclusion to recuperate and left the distorted space-time. He walked out of the divine warship to check on the situation of the Azura Grotto Heaven. The result was as he expected. The Azura Grotto Heaven had been completely devoured by the void and no longer existed. The divine formation and spatial door in the sea of clouds had also collapsed and disintegrated. That sky was originally the entrance to the Azura Grotto Heaven, but now it was already empty. From now on, the Azura Grotto Heaven was a thing of the past and would eventually be annihilated in the long river of history. After confirming that the Azura Grotto Heaven no longer existed, Ji Tianxing had to consider a problem. After occupying the boundless heaven continent, he had to set up a divine palace as the highest place of governance. Even if he was not in the boundless heaven continent, Nangong Bua had to oversee the various affairs of the continent to show his authority. The divine palace could not be built anywhere. It had to be built in the Grotto Heavens. In addition, after building the divine palace, there had to be a large number of guards and God King powerhouses stationed for a long time. This series of matters had to be considered at length. In addition, there were also the rewards of the 20 clans and sects that had to be carefully considered. Not only must there be no omissions, but there must also be a distinction between the severity of the matter. In addition to these few urgent matters, the subsequent control of the 90 domain masters and the entire boundless heaven continent also required strict regulations. Ji Tianxing thought for a while and decided to discuss it with Nangong Buhua. However, just as he was about to look for Nangong Buhua came to him. The two of them entered a study room inside the God-slaying battleship. After Ji Tianxing sat down, Nangong Buhua began to report the situation. He took out 10 interspatial rings and placed them on the desk in front of Ji Tianxing. His tone was a little excited as he said, "Alliance Master, fortunately, we didn't let you down. These past few days, the 20 elders and deacons of our clan have been counting the spoils of war day and night. We've finally finished sorting them out. The spoils of war from the Imperial Tutor and his subordinates' interspatial rings are worth more than 300 trillion. They're all stored in these 4 interspatial rings. There are some extremely precious materials and divine weapons whose value is difficult to estimate, so we didn't include them. The other 6 spatial rings were filled with the resources and treasures that had been taken from the treasury. Although many of the resources and treasures in the treasury have been taken away in advance, it's less than we expected. However, after counting them, we can still estimate that their value is at least 700 trillion godstones." Nangong Buhua was the clan leader of an ancient clan and had seen a lot in his life. However, even with his status and experience, he had never seen such a huge amount of cultivation resources and wealth. Therefore, when he reported these numbers, his voice trembled a little. Of course, he was excited. Ji Tianxing looked at the 10 interspatial rings on the table. He wasn't excited or happy. Instead, he frowned. The resources and wealth in these 10 interspatial rings exceed 1 trillion, which is 1,000 trillion. It's reasonable to say that the Shura God Emperor has been plundering the entire continent's cultivation resources for the past 1,000 years. The treasury of the Divine Palace should have more than 700 trillion worth of resources. After thinking for a while, he suddenly thought of something and understood the reason. As far as he knew, When the imperial tutor and the Meng Shui were in charge of the boundless heaven continent, they would organize a batch of cultivation resources every 50 years and send them to the depths of the void outside the realm for the Shura God Emperor to use. The Shura God Emperor and the other four gods did this. They spent an endless amount of cultivation resources to study the mystery of the gray fog. The last time the powerhouses under the Shura God Emperor returned to the boundless heaven continent to transport cultivation resources was 40 years ago. In other words, the 700 trillion worth of cultivation resources stored in the treasury of the Shura Divine Palace were most likely collected in the past 40 years. Thinking of this, he was relieved. At the same time, Ji Tianxing was also shocked. The people of the entire boundless heaven continent were enslaved by the Shura God Emperor and forced to plunder cultivation resources. In just 40 years, they were able to plunder 700 trillion worth of resources and treasures. This amount was too shocking. From this, it could be seen how rich the boundless heaven continent was and how vast the cultivation resources were. Fortunately, the cultivation resources of the divine world were even more plentiful and almost endless. Only then could it withstand the greed of the 5 god emperors for the past 1,000 years. If it were the dragon realm, the cultivation resources would be far inferior to the divine world. They would probably be emptied out. At this time, Nangong Buhua lowered his voice and said, "Alliance Master, now that the war has just ended and the news has just spread, the entire boundless heaven continent is in a state of shock and celebration. With these cultivation resources worth 1,000 trillion, you can recruit soldiers and horses, recruit talents, and absorb millions of soldiers. With millions of soldiers, you can firmly control the entire boundless heaven continent and be able to rest easy." Everyone knew that the boundless heaven continent had 100 regions. It was simply too vast. It was difficult for Ji Tianxing and the people of the Rebel Alliance to manage the entire continent, let alone take care of everything. Only by recruiting talents, like the Shura God Emperor, and gathering millions of soldiers under his command, could he completely control the boundless heaven continent. Ji Tianxing nodded and said, "This is feasible, but there's no rush. Wait until the situation stabilizes and then slowly implement it. After all, the leaders of the entire boundless heaven continent have all sworn to surrender and are completely loyal to me. There's nothing to worry about in the short term. Now, the most important thing is to set up a divine palace as the highest ruling place and establish authority. I've thought about it, but I haven't thought of which grotto heaven to set it up in." Nangong Buhua frowned and thought for a moment before coming up with an idea. "Alliance Master, weren't there a few clans who were loyal to the Imperial Tutor and fought with the Imperial Tutor? Now that the main forces of those clans have been destroyed by us, their grotto mansions are only left with some old and weak people. We can take back their grotto mansions, and you can choose a grotto heaven to build your divine palace." Chapter 4184. Nangong Buhua's words reminded Ji Tianxing. Previously, he was wondering if he should build the divine palace in the Nangong clan's Yinshu heavenly abode. The construction of the divine palace could be left to Nangong Buhua, and he would not have to worry about it. Moreover, he would leave the boundless heaven continent soon and leave everything to Nangong Buhua. This should be the most convenient and simple answer. However, after careful consideration, he felt that this was not a good choice. Firstly, the Yinshu heavenly abode was in the south of the continent and was a little far from the north. Secondly, if the divine palace was built in the Yinshu heavenly abode, the Nangong clan could control the entire boundless heaven continent. Even though Ji Tianxing believed in Nangong Buhua and Nangong Nihuang's character, problems would inevitably arise if the Nangong clan became the dominant clan. Thirdly, if he announced this result, the other clans and sects would definitely object. There would be disagreements within the Rebel Alliance, and Nangong Buhua would become the target of public criticism. Combining these factors, Ji Tianxing gave up the idea of building the Yinshu heavenly abode as the divine palace. Nangong Buhua's suggestion was to choose a suitable heavenly abode from the clans that were loyal to the imperial tutor to build the divine palace. This was the most feasible option. "This is a good suggestion." Ji Tianxing's eyes lit up and he smiled. The clan leaders and elders of those clans were killed in the war. However, they are loyal to the imperial tutor and the Shura god emperor. After the war, we will have to settle the score with them. Later, organize the information of those clans and give it to me so that I can choose a suitable heavenly abode. Nangong Buhua agreed readily. Ji Tianxing thought of something else and told him, "Later, go find Cave Master Shimi and pass on my order. Tell his spies to keep a close eye on the targets." The war had ended for 4 days, and the news had spread throughout the continent. Even though the imperial tutor is dead, there are still some clans that are loyal to the imperial tutor and the Shura god emperor, hiding in the dark. When those clans heard the news of the imperial tutor's defeat, they would either hide deeper and wait for the return of the Shura god emperor to seek revenge. Otherwise, they would escape and leave the boundless heaven continent. No matter which choice they make, Yu Yinshu heavenly abode must investigate. Nangong Buhua nodded again. Ji Tianxing continued. Also, inform the patriarchs and sect masters to come to the meeting room in 2 hours. I want to reward them according to their contributions. We should settle this matter as soon as possible so that they can rest at ease and go back to recuperate. Nangong Buhua hesitated for a moment and asked tentatively, "Alliance Master, do you plan to gather everyone together and announce the results of the reward in person? Should I summon them one by one and reward them individually? That would be better, right?" He was worried that the 20 clans would receive different rewards if they had different contributions. If everyone gathered and knew what rewards they had received, they would not feel good about it. It would not be good for the unity and cohesion of the Rebel Alliance. Ji Tianxing understood Buhua's worries and waved his hand to indicate that there was no need. "It's okay. Rewards based on contributions are not shameful. There's no need to hide it. We need to gather everyone and announce the rewards to convince the masses." Since he had already made up his mind, Nangong Buhua could only follow his orders. Nangong Buhua bowed and left the god-slaying battleship. Ji Tianxing went to the meeting room alone and sat at the head of the table. He pondered and considered the follow-up issues. Nangong Buhua went to carry out his mission. He passed the order to Shimi Cave Lord and organized the information of the ancient clans. After that, he went to inform the various clan leaders and Buhua. 2 hours passed quickly. Nangong Buhua entered the meeting room of the god-slaying battleship and presented a jade slip to Ji Tianxing. "Alliance leader, this is the information of the ancient clans, including their casualties in this war." Ji Tianxing nodded and read the jade slip quickly. Although the contents of the jade slip were complicated and numerous, he finished reading it very quickly. All kinds of information formed three-dimensional images in his mind for analysis and comparison. After a few breaths, Ji Tianxing had an answer and made his choice. These clans are loyal to the imperial tutor and the Azura god emperor. After the situation stabilizes, we have to clean them up. However, we have to deal with the Imperial River clan first and take down the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven as soon as possible. Nangong Buhua's eyes lit up. "Alliance leader, have you made up your mind to choose the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven as your palace and residence?" Ji Tianxing nodded in agreement. Nangong Buhua thought for a while and analyzed. In terms of the history, territory, and resources of the Grotto Heavens, the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven can be ranked in the top 3 in the Boundless Heaven continent. It is indeed an excellent place. In addition, the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven was located in the center of the Boundless Heaven continent. No matter which corner of the continent it was not too far away. Overall, it was indeed the best choice. Rest assured, Alliance Master, after today's meeting, this old man will carry out this mission. The matter of selecting a location for the Divine Palace was settled for the time being. At this time, more than a dozen patriarchs and sect masters entered the meeting room one after another to greet Ji Tianxing. Once the 20 patriarchs and sect masters were present, the meeting officially began. Ji Tianxing sat at the head of the table, glancing at the crowd calmly, and said with a dignified tone, "After a few days of rest, I believe the condition of the soldiers has improved a lot. It just so happens that the follow-up matters are almost settled. Today, I have gathered everyone here to discuss the merits and rewards. When all of you first joined the Alliance, I told all of you about this. You have just joined the Rebel Alliance, and we are still in the initial stage. No matter what benefits we promise you, they are all empty words. I'd rather give you your rewards after we've completed our task of subduing the rebels and we've won the battle. This is the real benefit, and also the reward for your bloody battle. In fact, only the first batch of patriarchs and sects that joined the Rebel Alliance were promised the corresponding benefits and treatment by Ji Tianqing. These 10 forces could each control a region and develop their forces and businesses in the surrounding 10 regions. However, the second batch of patriarchs and sects that were loyal to the Kenshin and joined the Rebel Alliance were obviously treated a level worse. They could only get their own regions and could not develop their forces and businesses in the surrounding 10 regions. However, these 10 forces were fence-sitters and had waited for 3 months before joining the Rebel Alliance. It was not bad to receive such treatment. Although they felt a little regretful, they did not dare to complain. Now, the Kenshin wanted to reward each force according to their performance, which comforted them. Chapter 4185. A whole year had passed since the establishment of the anti-rebel coalition and the uprising. Ji Tianqing was well aware of the various factions' performance in the past year. Even though he had been leading the Northern Army, he did not know much about the situation of the other 3 armies. But before that, he had Nangongwa, Division, and clan leader Wan Yan report the battle situation of the past few months in detail. Ji Tianqing spent a few hours reading all the battle reports and statistics. He had an answer in his heart. He knew which of the 20 factions were serious, risking their lives to carry out their missions, and were sincerely working for him and the Rebel Alliance. He also knew which factions were fishing in troubled waters, were passive and slack, and even what mistakes they had made and what thoughts they harbored. This way, he could be fair in his rewards and punishments. Of course, the 20 factions were all meritorious subjects and would not be punished. It was just that there was a big difference in the amount of rewards. Since the Xiong, Li, Zhuiqiu, and Ming clans joined the Rebel Alliance, their performance in the past few months has been very pertinent. They seriously carried out the orders of the Alliance and actively prepared for war. The disciples of the above 4 clans fought bravely against the enemy and suffered heavy casualties on the battlefield. 367, 315, 282, and 309 people died respectively. Apart from that, there are also many disciples who were seriously injured and are still recuperating. I'm deeply gratified that the disciples of the 4 clans are so loyal and brave. Here, I have prepared generous reward for the 4 clans to reward the meritorious subjects and comfort the heroic kings who sacrificed themselves. After he finished speaking, Ji Tianqing took out 4 spatial rings and waved his hand, throwing them in front of the 4 patriarchs. These 4 rings each contained 15 trillion worth of cultivation resources, as well as 40 God King level divine abilities and secret skills. There were slight differences in the amount of wealth in the 4 rings. But overall, the differences were not big, and it was difficult to calculate clearly. Everyone in the meeting room did not expect Ji Tianqing to read out the names of these 4 clans first. At that moment, the 16 clan leaders and sect leaders all looked at the 4 clan leaders in unison. Ji Tianqing's words were beautiful, praising the 4 families as loyal and brave, as if they had made great contributions. However, everyone was well aware that these 4 families were simply hooligans in the Rebel Alliance. Compared to the efforts of the other dozen or so forces, they were actually somewhat perfunctory and perfunctory. However, Ji Tianqing seemed to be kept in the dark and still gave them generous rewards. The 4 clan leaders did not expect that they would be so highly regarded by Kenshin that they would be the first to receive the rewards. After regaining their senses, they hurriedly stood up and bowed, thanking Ji Tianqing. Then, the 4 patriarchs eagerly took the spatial rings and roughly checked the treasures inside. When they saw the mountain-high, inexhaustible resources and 40 immeasurably profound and marvelous skills, they trembled in excitement. Oh my God, This reward is simply too generous. Lord Alliance Leader, you're so generous. On behalf of the Ming clan, I thank Lord Alliance Leader for this generous reward. Lord Alliance Leader is so generous to our clan. The Zwichio clan will definitely repay you for the rest of our lives. Tens of trillions of cultivation resources were nothing to Ji Tianxing. However, to the four ancient clans, it was almost 30 to 40% of their entire clan's wealth. It was enough for them to use for 3,000 years. This reward was indeed generous and extravagant. The other dozen clan leaders and sect leaders did not know the exact value of the cultivation resources in the four spatial rings. However, when they saw the four clan leaders bowing and thanking them excitedly, they guessed that the rewards would be very generous. Therefore, the blood of the clan leaders and sect leaders sped up, and their hearts were filled with excitement and anticipation. At this moment, Ji Tianxing continued the Dugu clan, the Wanyan clan, the Wanyan clan, and the Thousand Army Hall. After these six forces joined the rebel alliance, they strictly carried out orders. Moreover, their soldiers took the lead and fought with their lives on the line. I've seen everyone's performance and feel very gratified. Therefore, I hereby present generous gifts to show my appreciation, especially clan leader Dugajan and clan leader Wanyan. Not only are they loyal and brave, but they also understand my good intentions and help me solve my problems. They are worthy of learning and emulating. After he finished speaking, he took out 6 spatial rings and gave them to the 6 clan leaders, sect leaders, and sect leaders. These 6 interspatial rings contain cultivation resources worth 30 trillion and 80 divine abilities and secret techniques. Moreover, the spatial rings that clan leader Dugajan and clan leader Wanyan received contained an additional 5 trillion worth of cultivation resources and 10 secret techniques. The 6 clan leaders, and sect leaders roughly checked the rewards in the spatial rings and were immediately dazzled by the endless amount of cultivation resources. The 6 of them were stunned for a moment before they exclaimed in unison, revealing surprised and excited expressions. All hail the Alliance Leader. Lord Alliance Leader is so generous with his reward. We are ashamed to accept it. The 6 clan leaders did not look at it for long. They quickly kept the spatial rings and bowed to Ji Tianxing, expressing their sincere gratitude. To be honest, such generous rewards were indeed beyond their expectations. Ji Tianxing gave them a few more words of encouragement before his gaze landed on the last 10 clan leaders and sect leaders. The 10 clans, led by Nangong Buhua, were the first to join the rebel alliance. Everyone understood what Ji Tianxing meant by putting them at the end. Obviously, Ji Tianxing had given out the rewards in order from the least to the most. The 4 clans that received the rewards first actually received the least. Nangong clan, Phoenix clan, Lan clan, Aries clan, 100 Smelting Ancient Sect, and Shimi Wonderland are the founding members of the Rebel Alliance. They're also my staunchest supporters. In the past year, the 10 clans have worked hard and put in a lot of effort. I've seen it all and remembered it in my heart. Now, the Alliance's great cause has been achieved, and my initial promise has been fulfilled. However, the disciples of each clan have suffered great losses. Moreover, each clan has made an indelible contribution in this war. Therefore, I'm taking out 500 trillion worth of cultivation resources and 100 types of secret techniques to reward all of you. Ji Tianxing did not announce the exact value of the rewards for the first 2 batches of clans that received the rewards. Only the clan leaders who received the rewards could roughly estimate the value of the rewards themselves. However, it was different this time. Ji Tianxing directly announced the 2 numbers of 500 trillion and 100 types. Not only were the first 2 batches of clans that received the rewards dumbfounded, but they were also dumbfounded. Even the founding members of the 10 clans, the clan leaders, and the sect leaders were stunned. Their faces were filled with disbelief. Nangong Buhua was even more shocked. He subconsciously exclaimed, "Alliance Leader, you can't do this. The rewards you gave them previously are worth more than 200 trillion. Now, You're taking out 500 trillion worth of resources to reward us. Then, all the spoils of war you obtained from the Azure Divine Palace have been distributed to everyone. You didn't leave anything behind. Chapter 4186. Nangong Buhua couldn't help but say what was in his heart. When the patriarchs and sect masters heard this, their hearts trembled, and they all revealed expressions of disbelief. Everyone stared at Ji Tianxing, their eyes filled with awe and respect. After the previous battle, the various forces worked together to clean up the battlefield, count the spoils, and move the Azure Divine Palace's treasury. In the end, all the spoils were handed over to Nangong Buhua for safekeeping. Everyone only knew that there were a lot of spoils from that battle, and the value of the resources and treasures moved out of the treasury was immeasurable. Only now did they know that the value of the spoils of that battle was an astonishing 700 trillion. What was even more unbelievable was that Ji Tianxing didn't keep any of it and actually distributed all the spoils to everyone. This was definitely something that no one present had ever thought of and absolutely impossible to do. If they were the leaders of the Rebel Alliance, they would definitely keep more than half of the 700 trillion worth of resources and treasures. Taking out only 1 or 200 trillion worth of resources as a reward for everyone was already extremely benevolent. The 500 to 600 trillion worth of resources that were intercepted would all belong to them, but in name, they could be said to be the Rebel Alliance's assets. This was the most normal and reasonable thing to do. Therefore, Ji Tianxing's actions shocked everyone and made them admire him from the bottom of their hearts. Only now did they understand that Qin Shin's vision, realm, breadth of mind, and bearing were not something that they could speculate or compare to. This was the true spirit of swallowing mountains and rivers and embracing the world. Only such a powerhouse was worthy of controlling the boundless heaven continent and being worshipped by hundreds of millions of people. Looking at the dumbfounded patriarchs with complicated expressions, Ji Tianxing smiled and said, 700 trillion worth of cultivation resources and treasures is indeed a shocking amount of wealth. To be honest, even for me, this is a huge amount of wealth that I've never had before. However, the success of the Rebel Alliance's great cause is inseparable from everyone's bloody battles and contributions. Therefore, all of you are worthy of me rewarding you with 700 trillion worth of resources. I want you to understand that I and the Rebel Alliance are different from the Azure God Emperor. I will never be greedy for the resources of the boundless heaven continent and force and exploit the common people. There was another point, but Ji Tianxing didn't mention it. He was now the overlord of the boundless heaven continent, controlling and possessing the entire continent. No matter how many cultivation resources and treasures he wanted, it was something that could be easily obtained. While 700 trillion resources were astonishing compared to the entire boundless heaven continent, what did it count for? Moreover, he did not distribute all the spoils of war to the 20 forces. He kept the Imperial Tutor's quintessence shard, his interspatial ring, the Azure God Emperor's interspatial ring, and the quintessence shards of more than 100 God Kings. The total value of these spoils of war was probably no more than 100 trillion. But to Ji Tianxing, these were the most useful. After a while, the patriarchs and sect masters calmed down. Nangong Buhua and the rest kept the space rings and bowed to Ji Tianxing solemnly to thank him. Ji Tianxing gave them a few more words of encouragement, and then the rewards were over. Next, Ji Tianxing announced a few more things and assigned tasks to each force. First, he would take the Nangong clan to the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven to deal with the Imperial River Tribe, take over the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven, and build a divine palace and mansion. The other forces, such as the Lan clan, the War God clan, and the Phoenix clan, also shouldered different tasks to deal with different targets. They needed to go to the designated area to deal with the ancient clans loyal to the Imperial Tutor and the Azure God Emperor. Second, the war of rebellion on the boundless heaven continent had just ended, and the chaos had yet to subside. There were still many forces loyal to the Azure God Emperor who were still secretly active. The intelligence forces led by the Shimi Grotto Heaven had to closely monitor the movements of the boundless heaven continent and find out those forces as soon as possible. In addition, there were all kinds of complicated matters. Ji Tianxing could not do it himself, so he left them to the other forces. After Ji Tianxing announced a series of tasks, all the clan leaders and sect masters said yes in unison, and then bowed and left the god-slaying battleship. Not long after, the people of the 20 forces drove the battleship and parted ways in the sky to carry out their tasks. Only the Nangong clan's battleship stayed behind to follow the god-slaying battleship. Under Ji Tianxing's instructions, Nangong Bua put away the god-slaying battleship and stayed in the god-slaying battleship. Then White Dragon drove the god-slaying battleship straight to the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven. Nangong Bua stayed in the secret chamber to recuperate and heal his wounds, while Ji Tianxing returned to the distorted space-time of the Zhouqian Tenju Tower to count the spoils of war. The Azura, God Emperor, and the Imperial Tutor's spatial rings must contain unimaginable wealth and treasures. In addition, nearly 200 godly king realm godhead fragments were waiting for Ji Tianxing to refine. At the same time, Ji Tianxing led the more than 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance and successfully defeated the Imperial Tutor and his army. The news of their great victory spread across the boundless heaven continent. A few days ago, when the battle had just ended, Ji Tianxing had instructed the Shimi Grotto Heaven to deliberately release this news. Compared to the rumors circulating among the people, the news that the Shimi Grotto Heaven deliberately released seemed more official and detailed. When the people of the boundless heaven continent heard the news from the Shimi Grotto Heaven, they learned the details of the matter. It turned out that the Rebel Alliance had been in great danger after invading the Azura Grotto Heaven with unstoppable momentum. A few months ago, the Azura God Emperor's avatar had quietly returned to the Azura Grotto Heaven. However, the Azura God Emperor's avatar knew that he was no match for Kenshin, so he used an evil forbidden secret technique to sacrifice 99,000 gods to strengthen himself. When the final battle began, the Azura God Emperor's avatar had been strengthened to 50% of the original body strength. He thought that victory was in his grasp and that he could easily kill Kenshin and turn the tables. However, the final battle's outcome was beyond everyone's expectations. Kenshin and the Azura God Emperor's avatar fought, destroying the Azura Grotto Heaven and fighting in the void outside for half a day. In the end, Kenshin easily killed the Azura God Emperor's avatar and returned safely. The Rebel Alliance's army also destroyed the Azura Divine Palace and killed all the soldiers, including the Imperial Tutor. 3 days later, the shattered Azura Grotto Heaven could no longer bear the burden and was completely swallowed by the void, no longer existing. Henceforth, the era of the Azura God Emperor's rule over the boundless heaven continent had come to an end. The entire boundless heaven continent, 100 regions, and all the people were under the Rebel Alliance and Kenshin's command. When the people heard this series of news, they were all inexplicably shocked and cheered excitedly. During this period of time, every place on the boundless heaven continent, whether it was a bustling city or a mountain village, was discussing this shocking event. After all, this meant that an era had ended. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 4187. The ordinary citizens were naturally excited and agitated. They shouted, "Long live the Sword God! Long live the Sword God!" After all, they were the greatest beneficiaries. Kenshin overthrew the Azura God Emperor's rule and rescued all the people who were oppressed and enslaved. From now on, the people regained their freedom and no longer had to be enslaved and oppressed. The divine race and the 100 races would also coexist as equals. The people who were rescued not only obtained freedom, but also had more opportunities to cultivate, become stronger, and accumulate wealth that belonged to them. And in the past, more than half of the boundless heaven continent's cultivation resources would be seized by the Azura God Emperor. Everyone understood that after Kenshin ruled the boundless heaven continent, the entire continent would usher in a leap in development and improvement. The people would be richer, and more cultivation geniuses would emerge, and more deity realm powerhouses would appear. While the people were cheering and applauding, excited and shocked, the dignitaries of all levels of the boundless heaven continent were nervous and very tormented in their hearts. For example, those city lords, kings, and emperors were all on tenterhooks and filled with worry. All the regions of the boundless heaven continent surrendered, and those territorial lords all swore allegiance to Kenshin. For the various regions that were not loyal to Kenshin, the original territorial lords were also executed, and new territorial lords were elected. In other words, all the territorial lords were loyal to Kenshin and were under Kenshin's control. But below the territorial lords, there were still many empires, divine kingdoms and cities, and even many first-, second-, and third-rate family clans and sections. In the past, these dignitaries were under the rule of the Azura God Emperor, standing above the ordinary people. Now that the people obtained freedom, the status of these dignitaries became precarious. If they could be like those territorial lords, swearing allegiance to Kenshin, it would be easy to deal with. But the problem was that their status was too low, and they did not even have the qualifications to swear an oath of surrender. Therefore, they had always been worried that once Kenshin issued an order, the territorial lords of the various regions would start moving and eliminate them, these dignitaries, or replace them all. At that time, where should they go? Should they passively accept their fate and wait for death, or should they raise their arms and fight back like the Kenshin Rebel Alliance? The latter was completely impossible and unrealistic. They did not have the world-renowned prestige of the Kenshin, nor did they have the unparalleled strength and methods. When the time came, they would have no choice but to accept their fate and wait for death. Of course, there were also some forces that were very flexible and knew how to plan ahead and adapt in advance. They would not wait for that day to come. They would transfer their assets and manpower in advance and quietly escape. Those factions that remained neutral were still fine. Only a few of them had fled. Most of them were still hesitating and observing. After all, they would not easily give up the power, status, and wealth that they already had before they received concrete information about the Kenshin stance. However, those who were loyal to the Shura God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor were worried and anxious. Most of them chose to quietly flee the boundless heaven continent with their manpower and assets after hesitating and weighing the pros and cons. In their minds, since the Kenshin controlled the boundless heaven continent, they would go to other continents. Although they would lose their power and status, they would be able to keep their lives and have a chance to rise again when they went to other continents. Moreover, when the Shura God Emperor returned to the boundless heaven continent in the future, he would definitely seek revenge on the Kenshin. At that time, the Shura God Emperor would kill the Kenshin and retake the boundless heaven continent. They could still come back and seek refuge. If they stayed, the Kenshin would regard them as the remaining forces of the Shura God Emperor and eliminate them with iron and blood. However, the reactions of these nobles and forces had long been within Ji Tianxing's expectations. Shimi Grotto Heaven had integrated all the major intelligence forces and had been investigating and monitoring these forces. Almost every few days, Shimi Grotto Heaven would compile a list with detailed information and send it to Ji Tianxing. Although Ji Tianxing was far away in the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven, he could send messages and command the various forces and domain lords to intercept and eliminate those forces left behind by the Shura God Emperor. As for those neutral forces, even if they fled the boundless heaven continent with their families, Ji Tianxing did not pay any attention to them. A short 10 days later, another piece of news came out. Kenshin had personally led the Nangong clan to the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven. The Imperial River Tribe of the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven had pledged allegiance to the Shura God Emperor 1,000 years ago. They were the first ancient clans to pledge their loyalty to the Shura God Emperor. Because of this incident, the Imperial River Tribe had a very bad reputation among the common people, and many ancient clans despised and spurned them. However, the Imperial River Tribe was very sensible and led the other ancient clans, which was in line with the Shura God Emperor's wishes. Thus, the Imperial River Tribe had won the Imperial Tutor's trust and high regard over the past 1,000 years, and had received many benefits. As a result, the Imperial River Tribe developed faster than the other ancient clans, and their forces were also stronger. The infamy and humiliation that the Imperial River Tribe had borne for the past 1,000 years had long faded away with time. However, the benefits that they had received were real and tangible, which made many forces envious and jealous. As early as a few months ago, when the Rebel Alliance was in the limelight and invincible, many forces secretly speculated that the Imperial River Tribe might be in trouble. Now, when the news that Kenshin had personally gone to the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven spread, many people immediately clapped their hands and cheered. Everyone knew that Kenshin was going to settle the score with the Imperial River Tribe. As expected, Kenshin drove the god-slaying battleship and led hundreds of disciples of the Nangong clan to the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven openly. The Imperial River Tribe's clan leader, deputy clan leader, several elders, more than 30 deacons, and more than 1,000 elite disciples had all died in the previous battle. The Imperial River Tribe had lost more than 80% of its elite forces. Those who stayed in the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven were not old, weak, sick, or disabled, but they did not have much combat power anyway. Since the Imperial Tutor's defeat and the death of the Imperial River Tribe's clan leader and others, the entire Imperial River Tribe had suffered a terrible blow, and everyone had lost their backbone. During this period, the thousands of disciples who stayed in the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven were anxious and worried all day long. The thousands of people were divided into several factions, each with their own opinions, and they argued endlessly every day. Some people wanted to stay and guard the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven, and could not give up the inheritance passed down by their ancestors. If Kenshin came to settle the score, they could either fight to the death or admit defeat and surrender. All in all, the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven was the territory that the Imperial River Tribe had lived in for more than 30,000 years, and they could not give it up. Another group of people wanted to give up the 9 Defense Grotto Heaven as soon as possible and flee the boundless heaven continent with their clansmen and all their wealth. As the saying goes, where there is life, there is hope. As long as they could successfully go to other continents, they could continue the bloodline of the Imperial River Tribe and return to the peak one day. Chapter 4188. Among the thousands of disciples of the Imperial River Tribe, most of them insisted on these two ideas. Other than that, a small number of people had various ideas. But those ideas had obvious flaws, and their reasons were not sufficient. Most people did not agree with them. As time went by, those ideas that were not accepted by the masses were gradually drowned out. In these days, more than 8,000 people of the Imperial River Tribe had been debating whether to give up the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven and escape from the boundless heaven continent. Before the thousands of disciples could come to a conclusion, Kenshin arrived with the Nangong clan. The Imperial River Tribe had closed the entrance to the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven and activated the double defense array. But they still saw the god-slaying battleship at the array at the entrance. When the Imperial River Tribe heard the news, they were all worried and anxious like ants on a hot pan. Many Imperial River clan people panicked, running around in panic while murmuring, "We're doomed. We're doomed. We're dead. What should we do now? What should they do?" Some Imperial River Tribe members calmed down quickly after the panic. They hurried to inform their clansmen to pack their belongings and get ready to escape at any time. And those who insisted on giving up the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven and escaping from the boundless heaven continent were the angriest. As they packed their belongings and prepared to escape, they madly complained about those who refused to escape. If those people were not so stubborn and caused the clansmen to argue for so many days without a conclusion, they would have already given up the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven and escaped. However, everything they did was in vain. There was only one entrance to the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven, and Kenshin had blocked it. Thousands of Imperial River Tribe members could not escape. They could only hope that Kenshin would show them mercy and let them go. As for the double defense array at the Grotto Heaven's entrance, no one would be stupid enough to pin their hopes on those two arrays to stop Kenshin. That would be the biggest joke in the world. As for the 8,000 clansmen joining forces to fight Kenshin to the end, that would be suicidal. For a moment, the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven was in chaos. Thousands of Imperial River tribe members ran around, but no one could take charge of the situation. 2 older and respected deacons stepped forward and led more than 200 young disciples to the Grotto Heaven's entrance to check the situation. At the entrance of the Grotto Heaven, Ji Tianxing led Nangong Buhua, Nangong Ni Huang, and the others out of the god-slaying battleship. Ji Tianxing was not surprised to see that there was no one at the entrance of the Grotto Heaven. Even the spatial door at the entrance was closed. Nangong Buhua frowned and said in a low voice, Cave Lord Shimi sent a message saying that no one from the Imperial River Tribe had escaped until this morning. It seems that the Imperial River Tribe is planning to hide in their Grotto Heaven and not show their faces. Nangong Ni Huang looked coldly at the entrance of the Grotto Heaven and snorted. Do they think they are safe just because they are hiding in the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven? Since the Alliance Master had decided to expropriate this heavenly abode for the Divine Palace and the mansion, the Imperial River Tribe had no choice but to hand it over. Not to mention that Patriarch Yu He, the Guardians, and the Elders killed many disciples of my clan during the war. We must avenge them. Nangong Ni Huang hated the Imperial River Tribe, so she came here with the intention of taking revenge. Without waiting for Ji Tianxing to give the order, she volunteered and saluted. Alliance Master, please allow me to lead the disciples of the Nangong clan to break through the entrance of the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven. Ji Tianxing looked at her and said calmly, I believe you can do it, but most of the disciples of the Nangong clan are injured, and you have not recovered from your injuries. If I really let you break through the entrance, not only will it take a day, but it will also consume a lot of divine power. There is no need for that. Let me do it myself. It will be done in an hour at most. After that, he used the divine mystic technique to carefully observe the spatial door and array at the entrance of the Grotto Heaven. After a short while, he found some clues and knew what to do. The defensive array at the entrance of the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven was a king-level superior divine array. Although the divine array was exquisite and complicated, with thousands of changes, it was not a king-level superior divine array. However, the grade of the divine array wasn't high, so it wasn't a problem for Ji Tianxing. He frowned and pondered for a few minutes before deducing a way to break through it. Then, he personally cast a spell to break the array at the entrance. Nangong Buhua, Nangong Ni Huang, and the others assisted him. Just as Ji Tianxing, Nangong Buhua, and the others were casting spells to break the array, the 2 elderly deacons of the Imperial River Tribe led more than 200 disciples to the entrance of the Grotto Heaven. They used the array to observe the situation outside the entrance. When they saw Ji Tianxing, Nangong Buhua, and the others breaking the array, their faces turned grave, and their hearts were filled with anxiety and worry. Panic and fear spread among the crowd. Many of the young disciples seemed to have foreseen the arrival of death. In the face of Kenshin, a legendary expert, they could not even muster the will to resist. Seeing that the disciples' emotions were not normal, the 2 elderly deacons quickly comforted them and explained, Everyone, don't panic. They have not broken through the defensive array yet. We still have time. Moreover, judging from Kenshin's appearance and aura, he does not look like he is here to kill all of us. That's right. If Kenshin wanted to settle accounts with the Imperial River Tribe and kill all of our tribesmen, he would definitely have brought a large army and come here with a murderous aura. However, he only brought the Nangong tribe's experts and a few supreme gods with him. There is no army at all. This means that he is not here to kill us. He is most likely here to subdue us. Hearing the 2 elderly deacons' words, more than 200 young disciples calmed down significantly. Among these people, a portion of them were originally in favor of surrendering. If what the elderly deacons said was true, and Kenshin was here to subdue them, then it was not a big deal. They could just surrender directly. However, they could not help but worry. What if Kenshin was not here to subdue them, but to kill all of them and eliminate all of them? They could not possibly entrust their lives to the mercy of their enemy, right? At the thought of this, many of them could not help but shiver, and a chill ran down their spines. However, when they thought about it carefully, even if Kenshin was here to kill them, they did not seem to have any way to survive. If that was the case, then they could only resign themselves to fate. Time passed quietly. Before they knew it, 45 minutes had passed. At this time, Ji Tianxing had broken through the space door in defensive array at the entrance of the Nine-Palace Grotto Heaven. As the dazzling divine light shone, the space door at the entrance of the Grotto Heaven opened. Swoosh! A wise and mighty figure in a white robe stepped through the space door and entered the Nine-Palace Grotto Heaven. Nangong Buhua, Nangong Ni Huang, and the others followed closely behind. Even the deity slaying battleship shrunk to about 3 feet and entered the Nine-Palace Grotto Heaven through the space door. At this moment, the 2 elderly deacons and more than 200 disciples of the Imperial River tribe all focused their attention on the white-robed young man. Everyone's nerves were tense as they gripped their divine weapons tightly. Chapter 4189. The air seemed to have frozen. There was dead silence at the entrance of the Grotto Heaven. Ji Tianxing, Nangong Buhua, Nangong Ni Huang, and the others stood in the sky near the entrance. 100 miles away, 2 elderly deacons and more than 200 young disciples were holding their swords and sabers tightly, looking at the crowd with vigilance and fear. No one spoke, and the 2 sides just looked at each other in silence. The disciples of the Imperial River tribe were all holding their weapons and pointing them at Ji Tianxing and the others, ready to fight at any time. But their pale faces, frightened eyes, and trembling hands all revealed the fear in their hearts. They were afraid that Kenshin would turn all of them into dregs and powder with a wave of his hand. But no matter how scared they were, they did not dare to take the lead and attack Kenshin. Just like that, the disciples of the Imperial River tribe did not dare to make sound. They stood rooted to the ground and did not dare to act rashly. Fortunately, Ji Tianxing looked at the crowd, walked toward them, and spoke. Although the main force of the Imperial River tribe died in the war, those who stayed in the Grotto Heaven are old, weak, sick, and disabled. But no matter what, there are more than 200 of them, right? Where are the others? Ji Tianxing strode across the sky, walking towards the crowd at a moderate pace. Although he looked calm and his tone was calm, without any murderous intent or anger, he was too famous. The aura of an expert that he naturally exuded made the disciples of the Imperial River tribe tremble with fear. Seeing him walking towards them, the 200-plus people trembled and couldn't help but retreat. It was as if there was an invisible wall in the sky that was pushing them back. Seeing these people's reaction, Ji Tianxing did not say anything more. He led Nangong Buhua and the others deeper into the Grotto Heaven. Along the way, he kept looking around and sensing the aura of the divine power in the Grotto Heaven. In general, the Grotto Heaven was rich in resources and divine power. It was indeed a rare place for cultivation. The 2 old deacons and more than 200 disciples of the Imperial River tribe flew away in fright when they saw Ji Tianxing and the others. Some of the smarter disciples had already retreated to the depths of the heavenly abode to inform their clansmen. Some of the smart Alecs retreated to the sides, hoping that the Kenshin would ignore them. After Kenshin and the others left, they would find a way to escape from the Nine-Palace Grotto Heaven. Then, they would have a great chance of survival. However, as soon as these disciples retreated to the sides, Nangong Buhua and Nangong Ni Huang's divine senses locked onto them. Wisps of imperious, sharp divine sense filled with murderous intent locked onto them, causing them to be stunned in place. Their bodies stiffened like stone statues. They didn't dare to run anymore. They turned around with difficulty and saw Nangong Buhua, Nangong Ni Huang, and the others' cold faces and sharp eyes. Therefore, they immediately understood what Nangong Buhua and the others meant. You want to take the opportunity to escape? No way. The disciples who thought themselves clever could only lower their heads and retreat into the depths of the heavenly abode obediently. Before Tianxing and the others arrived at the palaces of the Imperial River Tribe, a few disciples came back to inform them. The thousands of panicked Imperial River Tribe members were so nervous that they almost suffocated when they learned that Qin Shi had brought people into the nine-palace grotto heaven. However, the disciples who came back told them that Qin Shi had only brought 7 divine kings in. Moreover, Qin Shi looked very calm and indifferent. He didn't have any murderous intent, nor did he attack them. At present, Qin Shi didn't seem to be here to eradicate them. He was most likely here to negotiate or to subdue them. After hearing this news, more than half of the Imperial River Tribe members heaved a sigh of relief. They looked relieved. As long as Qin Shi didn't kill them and was willing to spare their lives, they didn't mind surrendering. With this thought in mind, the crowd quickly calmed down. At this moment, a few deacons stood out and said to the clansmen, "Everyone calm down. From the current situation, Qin Shi doesn't seem to have the intention to kill all of us. Don't panic. Previously, we were divided into 2 factions, arguing over whether to escape or not. Now that things have developed to this point, we have no other choice. If we surrender and pledge our loyalty to Qin Shi, we can still keep our lives. If there's anyone who isn't afraid of death and would rather sacrifice their lives to maintain their dignity and integrity, we won't stop them. No matter what, Qin Shi didn't attack us directly. This means that there's still room for negotiation. I hope everyone can calm down. It's best if you can get into formation and wait here for Qin Shi's arrival." That's right. We need to show our sincerity in surrendering and show the appropriate attitude. Only then will Qin Shi forgive us. If everyone is still in a mess and doesn't follow the rules, I'm afraid that Qin Shi will kill us all in a fit of rage. Thus, the deacons took the lead and calmed down the 8,000 clansmen. They led everyone to the plaza of the main peak. After a full 100 breaths, the 8,000 Imperial River Tribe members gathered at the plaza and lined up neatly. Then, everyone waited silently in the square with an uneasy feeling. They weren't just waiting for Qin Shi. They were waiting for the judgment of fate. 15 minutes later, Tianxing led Nangong Buhua and the others to the depths of the 9 imperial caves, where the Imperial River Tribe lived. There was nothing new here. It was still surrounded by mountains. Splendid palaces and magnificent mansions were built on top of more than 50 lofty mountains. Before Tianxing entered the 9 imperial caves, he had received the relevant information and knew that there were more than 8,000 people in the 9 imperial caves. He had thought that the 8,000 Imperial River Tribe members would be in a mess and scattered in various mountains. It would be a noisy scene, or they would be scared out of their wits. They would pack up their belongings and scatter, hiding in various corners of the 9 imperial caves. Or the 8,000 Imperial River Tribe members would be motivated and set up an ambush with integrity to fight to the death with him. He had several predictions and guesses, but he didn't expect that the 8,000 Imperial River Tribe members would gather at the plaza of the main peak and line up neatly. Not only him, even Nangong Buhua and Nangong Nihuang didn't expect this result. They flew over the mountains and came to the sky above the main peak. They looked down at the 8,000 Imperial River Tribe members in the plaza below. Seeing the situation in the plaza and the expressions of the Imperial River Tribe members, Nangong Buhua and Nangong Nihuang couldn't help but discuss. These Imperial River Tribe members are very sensible. They actually gathered together to wait for the arrival of the alliance leader. Humph, a group of people with no dignity and integrity. 1,000 years ago, the Imperial River Tribe was the first to submit to the Azura God Emperor. Now that the alliance leader controls the boundless heaven continent, they are repeating the scene of that time. That's right. It's the characteristic of the Imperial River Tribe to be flexible. As long as they can survive, they don't care about dignity and integrity. Chapter 4190. More than 8,000 members of the Imperial River clan gathered in the square and put on a posture of sincere surrender. Although it was very surprising, it made sense when one thought about it carefully. After all, it was not the first time the Imperial River clan had done such a thing. Even though they had been despised by the ancient clans for thousands of years, the Imperial River Clan did not feel ashamed and still acted as before. Although the Imperial River Clan's tactful surrender reduced some trouble for Ji Tianxing, Nangong Buhua, and the others. But this still did not dispel the contempt and disdain for the Imperial River Clan, especially Nangong Ni Huang. While despising and disdaining the Imperial River Clan, she also felt a little regretful. This was because she had wanted to kill the Imperial River Clan and avenge her clansmen who had died in the battle. But more than 8,000 members of the Imperial River Clan had bowed and surrendered. Given Kenshin's character, he would definitely not kill these people who surrendered. At most, he would imprison or exile them. Nangong Ni Huang would not disobey Kenshin's orders for revenge. Therefore, she could only regretfully give up on the idea of revenge. At this moment, more than 8,000 members of the Imperial River Clan in the square, under the leadership of several deacons, bowed in unison to Ji Tianxing. Greetings to Lord Kenshin. May Kenshin's martial arts prosper and live as long as the heavens. More than 8,000 people saluted and shouted in unison. The rolling sound reverberated between heaven and earth, and it was somewhat deafening. However, when Ji Tianxing heard what the crowd was shouting, he frowned slightly. Nangong Buhua, Nangong Ni Huang, and the others did not hide their disdain and disdain. The Imperial River Clan was a powerful clan that had been tyrannical for thousands of years. They were the real overlords. Now, these people of the Imperial River Clan actually called themselves commoners. This posture was so low that they wanted to bury their heads in the ground. As for wishing Kenshin's martial arts prosper and live as long as the heavens and so on, it was even more nauseating. Even the 20 forces of the Rebel Alliance, who worshipped and respected Kenshin, could not say such words. This showed how strong the Imperial River Clan's desire to survive was. After more than 8,000 members of the Imperial River Clan saluted, they respectfully lowered their heads and waited for Ji Tianxing to deal with them. They also ignored the disdainful looks of Nangong Buhua and the others, and did not feel ashamed at all. In their view, it was not shameful to bow their heads in order to survive. The deacons looked at each other and hesitated. They didn't dare to answer. Apart from them, there were 14 other deacons and elders in the Divine King realm who had secretly left the 9 imperial caves a few days ago. In addition, over 500 of our clan's disciples have also escaped in the past 10 days. Ji Tianxing nodded slightly and did not say anything. However, he turned to look at Nangong Buhua and gave him a meaningful look. Nangong Buhua immediately understood that the look meant, "I'll leave those Imperial River Clan members to you." Nangong Buhua hurriedly nodded to show that he understood. Nangong Ni Huang saw the eye contact between the two of them and was shocked. She cast a grateful look at Ji Tianxing. She knew that Ji Tianxing was deliberately giving her a chance to take revenge, to fulfill her wishes and make up for her regrets. However, everyone was well aware of this matter. It could only be understood and not spoken of. If Ji Tianxing ordered the Nangong clan to hunt down the Imperial River Clan members who had escaped, it would seem that the Kenshin was too narrow-minded and ruthless. It would be easy for people to criticize them. However, the Nangong clan would have sufficient reasons and excuses to do so. They would not be afraid of people criticizing them. At this moment, Ji Tianxing took out a jade slip and threw it in front of the deacons. Swoosh! The jade slip emitted a dazzling white light and formed a huge light screen in the air. Hundreds of golden words appeared on the light screen. There was no doubt that the words that appeared in front of everyone was the famous Kenshin's exclusive version of the Pledge of Surrender. In the past year, almost 100 territorial lords of the boundless heaven continent had publicly recited this pledge of heavenly Tao. Therefore, the terror of this Pledge of Surrender had already spread throughout the boundless heaven continent. Many experts and first-rate forces even knew part of the Pledge of Surrender's content. You should know my rules. If you want to live, recite it accordingly. Ji Tianxing looked down at the over 8,000 Imperial River Clan members and said expressionlessly. Hearing this, The people of the Imperial River clan on the square were all dumbfounded. They all looked at each other in disbelief. Nangong Buhua, Nangong Ni Huang, and the others were also stunned. They did not expect Ji Tianqing to do this. In the past, only the territorial lords and the leaders of the top forces were qualified to recite the Pledge of Surrender. They did not expect that over 8,000 Imperial River clan members, who were old and weak, could also enjoy such an honor. That's right. The people of the Boundless Heaven continent were proud to recite the Pledge of Surrender. Over 8,000 people reciting the Pledge of Surrender together. That scene was exciting. Thinking of this, Nangong Buhua and the others also looked at the Imperial River clan members with interest. The ordinary clansmen were still in a daze. A few older deacons, who had been through storms, immediately came to their senses. No matter what they thought in their hearts, they all showed grateful and flattered expressions on their faces. They knelt on the ground respectfully and kowtowed to Ji Tianqing in fear and trepidation. "Thank you, Lord Kenshin, for sparing our lives." With a few deacons taking the lead, the remaining 8,000 Imperial River clan members all knelt and kowtowed to Kenshin. Although there were a few dozen people among the 8,000 Imperial River clan members who still had some backbone and dignity, they felt humiliated. They were unwilling to kowtow to Ji Tianqing because they felt humiliated. However, they would be too conspicuous if they stood still when over 8,000 clansmen kowtowed. If the sword god were to use him as an example and kill the chicken to warn the monkey, then he would die too unjustly. Therefore, they suppressed the humiliation and kowtowed with their clansmen. Anyway, they were not the only ones who felt humiliated. Everyone felt the same. After kowtowing, the 8,000 Imperial River clan members recited the Pledge of Surrender in unison. Their expressions and voices were very solemn. It was only then that Nangong Buhua, Nangong Ni Huang, and the others noticed that the Pledge of Surrender that the Imperial River clan recited was different from the one they had recited. The Pledge of Surrender was shorter. It was obvious that Kenshin had set it up for the Imperial River clan. Chapter 4191. The Imperial River tribesmen quickly finished reciting the 300-word heavenly oath. At this moment, everyone lit up with divine light, and a trace of Taoist rhyme appeared above their heads. Above the sky, the five-color divine lightning flashed, and the sound of thunder could be heard. Obviously, the heavenly oath was in effect, and the content of the oath was witnessed and supervised by the heavens. The 8,000 tribesmen were all shocked by the supreme heavenly power, and they stood there solemnly, not daring to move. Nangong Buhua, Nangong Ni Huang, and the others also understood that Ji Tianqing set up this heavenly oath to restrain the Imperial River tribe. Even if the Imperial River tribe members recited the oath, they would not be appointed and trained by Ji Tianqing. They would be dealt with as they should. As expected, after the heavenly vision ended, Ji Tianqing said to the 8,000 tribesmen, "Seeing that you know your mistakes and are sincere in surrendering, I can spare your lives. But you must be punished for your mistakes, so as to warn the world to avoid repeating the same mistakes. I announce that all the Imperial River tribe members will be expelled from the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven and exiled to the far north ice field. Within 3,000 years, you are not allowed to leave the far north ice field, or you will be killed." The Imperial River tribe had expected that Kenshin would not let them go so easily. Even if they recited the oath, they would still be punished. But they did not expect that Kenshin would give them such a punishment. For a moment, the 8,000 tribesmen were petrified, and their expressions were extremely ugly. This punishment was not too serious for the Imperial River tribe, but it was definitely not light. Although they were not tortured or deprived of their wealth and strength, their freedom was restricted. Not only did they lose the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven, where their ancestors had lived for generations, but they were also exiled to the barren and cold far north ice field for 3,000 years. It was a nightmare for them to be exiled to the far north ice field from the picturesque and rich land of the central region to deal with all kinds of ferocious beasts and sea tribes. After all, the far north ice field was in the northernmost part of the Boundless Heaven continent, between the Tianbei region and the Sunset Sea region. Ferocious beasts ran rampant there, and it was filled with many evil people who were wanted by the Boundless Heaven continent. Often, savage members of the sea race would enter that area to burn, kill, and loot. Thinking of this, the people of the Imperial River race trembled with fear as if they had lost their parents. However, Kenshin's orders could not be disobeyed. They had already sworn a heavenly oath. If they disobeyed orders or escaped on the way to the icy plains of the far north, Kenshin wouldn't even need to do anything. They would be punished by the heavens and turned into ashes by divine lightning. Therefore, more than 8,000 Imperial River tribe members were silent for a long time and could only lower their heads silently, indicating that they had accepted their fate. Nangong Buhua, Nangong Ni Huang, and the others smiled when they saw the fate of the Imperial River tribe. Everyone agreed with Ji Tianxing's punishment. Ji Tianxing was kind enough to give the Imperial River clan people 6 hours to pack up their belongings and pack up. Initially, the Imperial River tribe thought that the treasury would be plundered by the Kenshin. There weren't many resources and wealth in the treasury, and most of them had been taken away by the fleeing elders and deacons. However, the remaining cultivation resources were worth more than 60 trillion, enough for more than 8,000 people to live for 1,000 years. They didn't expect that Kenshin would not take a single thing and let them take away the resources and wealth in the treasury. The people of the Imperial River tribe were secretly grateful for this. They also admired the character of the sword god. Unknowingly, 6 hours had passed. More than 8,000 Imperial River tribe members packed up their belongings and left the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven on 4 divine warships with sad expressions. The entire fleet was filled with sadness, helplessness, and decadence. They calmly and quietly flew north. After the Imperial River tribe left, Nangong Buhua summoned a few hundred Nangong tribesmen to occupy the palaces of the Imperial River tribe and clean up the palaces. Nangong Buhua and Nangong Ni Huang accompanied Ji Tianxing as they strolled in the sky. They observed and sized up the palaces within 1,000 miles. Do you have any suggestions? Ji Tianxing stopped and turned to look at the Nangong father and daughter. Nangong Ni Huang thought for a moment and took the lead to say, "Alliance Master, the palaces of the Imperial River tribe have not experienced the flames of war and are very well preserved. It also saves us a lot of time, manpower, and material resources in building the divine palaces. However, the Imperial River Divine Palace on the main peak can be demolished and a higher standard palace can be built according to your preferences and instructions. Other than that, I think we can keep the 58 divine palaces and 42 mansions." Nangong Buhua nodded in agreement and said, "If Alliance Master has enough time to ask us to build a bigger and more sacred divine palace, we will do our best. However, since Alliance Master wants to solve this matter as soon as possible, I think we can keep the existing palaces and mansions and only demolish the Imperial River Divine Palace to rebuild. Also, if Alliance Master has any requirements for the layout of the cave residence, we can make some changes." Ji Tianxing nodded and said with a smile, "Actually, I want to occupy the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven and build the divine palaces and cave residence here. It is more symbolic than practical. After all, after the situation in the Boundless Heaven continent stabilizes, I will leave and go to other continents to continue saving the people. Since I won't be living here and I don't have that many soldiers and guards under me, why should I build more palaces? Therefore, both of you are right. We only need to demolish the Imperial River Divine Palace and build a more sacred and majestic one. As for the other peaks, palaces, and mansions, I will tell you later where you need to modify and adjust." In fact, as early as when the Rebel Alliance was established, Nangong Buhua and Nangong Ni Huang knew that Ji Tianxing would leave after the situation in the Boundless Heaven continent stabilized. After all, Ji Tianxing truly cared about the world and wanted to save the people of the 5 continents. In other words, he wanted to occupy the entire God Realm and save all the people of the God Realm. The father and daughter were already mentally prepared and knew that Ji Tianxing would leave sooner or later. But now, after hearing Ji Tianxing mention this matter, they realized that the date of Ji Tianxing's departure was very close. The father and daughter suddenly felt a little reluctant in their hearts. Especially Nangong Huang. The way she looked at Ji Tianxing became much gentler and more complicated. But the father and daughter were not coy people. They understood what kind of person Qin Shin was, so of course, they would not pretend to persuade him to stay. Both of them nodded to show that they understood, then took out jade slips and listened to Ji Tianxing's instructions. Ji Tianxing stood high in the sky and pointed at several peaks and palaces, suggesting that they should modify and adjust them. The father and daughter listened carefully and recorded it in jade slips. 15 minutes later, Ji Tianxing finished what he needed to say. Nangong Buhua put away the jade slips, bowed to him, and left to pass down the order and carry out the modification task. With his swift and decisive character, he estimated that he would be able to complete the modification of the Divine Palace within 10 days. Chapter 4192. For the next 10 days, Ji Tianxing stayed in the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven. Under the leadership of Nangong Buhua and Nangong Huang, the disciples of the Nangong clan were busy remodeling and rebuilding the palace. Ji Tianxing stayed in the distorted space-time of the 9 Heavens Tenju Tower, busy counting the spoils of war and refining the godhead fragments of the God Kings. Among the many spoils of war, the space rings of the Azura God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor were the most important. Ji Tianxing spent an entire day tidying up the 2 space rings. All kinds of rare materials, top-notch materials, gems, and treasures were piled up into mountains. Just the space rings of the Imperial Tutor and the Azura God Emperor were filled with cultivation resources and wealth, which were comparable to the spoils of war seized by the Rebel Alliance. Ji Tianxing roughly estimated that the resources in the 2 space rings were worth between 700 trillion and 800 trillion. In terms of cultivation resources and treasures, of course, it couldn't compare to the spoils of war seized by the Rebel Alliance. If the spoils of war could be piled up into 300 mountains, this batch of resources and treasures could only be piled up into 50 mountains at most. However, although this batch of resources and treasures was small in quantity, their quality and value were much higher. Ji Tianxing put these resources and treasures into a space ring and arranged them according to their categories. After that, he picked out a dozen top-notch materials. There were a total of 16 materials, all of which were of top-notch quality and priceless. There were even a few materials that only existed in legends and hadn't appeared in the world for thousands of years. Only experts like the Imperial Tutor and the Azura God Emperor had such rare materials. Ji Tianxing picked out these materials because he wanted to forge the Burial of Heaven's Sword and improve the quality and power of the Burial of Heaven's Sword. Many years ago, he had this idea. He wanted to improve the quality of the Burial of Heaven's Sword to the limit of the king level. Unfortunately, too many materials were needed to forge the Burial of Heaven's Sword, and they were too rare and precious. If he were to travel the world and travel through the major star fields to find them, it would take him at least 100 years. Therefore, this matter had been put aside until now. He didn't expect to find hundreds of precious materials in the space rings of the Imperial Tutor and the Azura God Emperor. He filtered through them and found these 16 sets of materials, which were just enough to upgrade the Burial of Heaven's Sword. After making up his mind and gathering materials, Ji Tianxing no longer hesitated and started forging. He summoned the 9 Heavens Cauldron, activated the formation array of the Divine Cauldron. When the Great Formation was operating normally and the temperature in the Divine Cauldron had reached a suitable standard, he took out the Heaven Burier sword and threw it into the Divine Cauldron to refine it. 3 days later, the refining materials of the Cauldron of Heaven's Sword refinement were Cauldron. Of days after, recasting and smelting the Heaven Burier sword was very taxing on one's mind. It required Ji Tianxing to continuously cast spells. The process was not only meticulous, but it also took a long time. However, Ji Tianxing was already used to it. He focused on refining the Burial of Heaven Sword day after day. 10 days passed in the blink of an eye. Nangong Buhua, led the disciples of the Nangong clan to complete the renovation of the palaces and residences. The layout of the 58 mountains, the 108 palaces, and the residences became even more majestic, forming a heaven and earth great formation of their own. After Ji Tianxing's guidance and the Nangong clan's renovation of the palaces, not only did they look more sacred and dignified, but they also became more practical. Especially on the main peak, the dazzling Tianxing Divine Palace, which was as dazzling as the sun, was even more majestic and imposing. Ji Tianxing named the newly built Divine Palace Tianxing Divine Palace. Nangong Buhua, Nangong Nihuang, and the others did not delve into the meaning behind this name. In their opinion, Qinshin's name was Qianxing, and this palace was named Tianxing Divine Palace. It was normal for it to be related to the word Tian. In addition, the name of the 9 defense grotto heaven was not changed. After these 10 days, the relevant news had long spread throughout the boundless heaven continent and was known by the common people of the world. Everyone knew that Qinshin was merciful and forgave the thousands of Imperial River Tribe members. He did not even touch the Imperial River Tribe's treasury and resources. However, in order to show his authority and punish them, Qinshin ordered the Imperial River Tribe members to swear an oath and exile them to the far North Ice Plains. They were not allowed to return to the boundless heaven continent for 3,000 years. The people of the boundless heaven continent felt that this punishment was more reasonable. He punished the Imperial River Tribe, but did not exterminate them. He gave them a way out. From this, it could be seen that Qinshin was magnanimous and merciful. He was indeed a wise ruler. After Qinshin punished the Imperial River Tribe, the 9 defense grotto heaven naturally belonged to Qinshin. Qinshin built the Tianxing Divine Palace in the 9 defense grotto heaven and set it up as a cave abode. It was the center of power that controlled the boundless heaven continent. After this news spread, it also caused a huge commotion among the people, causing hundreds of millions of people to talk about it. If nothing unexpected happened, it was basically certain that the sword god controlling the boundless heaven continent had already become an established fact. Since Qinshin had confirmed that the 9 defense grotto heaven was a cave abode, the next step would be to recruit troops and build a guard army and a patrol envoy team. The former would guard the 9 defense grotto heaven and maintain its safety and authority. The latter would patrol the boundless heaven continent and supervise the 100 territories. However, everyone knew that Qinshin's forces were the various ancient clans and sections. Those were the top nobles and overlords. Naturally, they could not be stationed in the 9 defense grotto heaven to be Qinshin's guards, nor could they be patrol envoys. As a result, Qinshin could only recruit ambitious people from the people and bring them under his command. Many Divine Lord Realm experts and Divine King Realm powerhouses all saw the hope of a meteoric rise. As a result, those clever experts and experts on the boundless heaven continent took the initiative to seek refuge without waiting for Qinshin to issue an edict to the world. On the other hand, several ancient forces of the Rebel Alliance were still tracking down and intercepting the remaining forces of the Imperial Tutor and the Azura God Emperor. Nangong Nihuang had also led several elders, deacons, and many divine kings in her clan to personally search for and intercept those elders and deacons of the Imperial River Tribe who had fled in advance. With Ji Tianxing's approval, the Ximi Grotto Heaven secretly merged with the intelligence forces under the Imperial Tutor and took over the intelligence network that covered the entire continent. In short, Ji Tianxing had the overall situation under control. The chaotic and uneasy boundless heaven continent gradually regained its calm. Of course, the calm was only on the surface. There were still some undercurrents behind the scenes. However, under such a big situation, those small and scattered undercurrents could not raise any waves. As time passed, the remaining forces of the Imperial Tutor and the Azura God Emperor were destined to be wiped out. Qinshin's ruling power and control of the boundless heaven continent would also be strengthened layer by layer. Chapter 4193. 10 days had passed in the outside world, and Ji Tianxing had already been in the distorted space-time for more than a year. He first spent half a year casting spells to refine the Sword of Burial of Heaven, successfully forging it into a top-grade king-level divine sword. Moreover, the Sword of Burial of Heaven was already the best of the best. Its quality and power had reached the peak of the king level. If it went one step further, it would surpass the shackles and become an emperor-level divine weapon. Of course, that was if there was an emperor-level divine weapon. After forging the Sword of Burial of Heaven, in the remaining months, Ji Tianxing began to circulate his energy to refine the godhead fragments of the Imperial Tutor and the many God-King level powerhouses. The Imperial Tutor's godhead fragments were naturally of the utmost importance. Not only was the Imperial Tutor a peak God-King, but he had mastered more divine Tao laws. More importantly, the Imperial Tutor was the Azura God Emperor's #1 confidant, and he definitely knew many secrets. As expected, Ji Tianxing spent a month's time to completely refine the Imperial Tutor's godhead fragments and plunder the Imperial Tutor's divine soul memories. Through the Imperial Tutor's divine soul memories, he indeed knew many of the Azura God Emperor's secrets. For example, when the Azura God Emperor left the God Realm, how many elite forces did he take with him? How many God King level powerhouses were there? What realm they were at? How many upper divine lords were there? How many people were there? And how many cultivation resources the boundless heaven continent sent to the Azura God Emperor every 50 years, and so on. In this way, Ji Tianxing had a very detailed understanding of the number of powerhouses and military strength under the Azura God Emperor's command. Of course, he only used this number as a basis to make a judgment of the Azura God Emperor's military strength. He was well aware that the Azura God Emperor not only took away a lot of military strength from the boundless heaven continent, but also gathered many powerhouses and experts in outer space. Even though he had already destroyed the Azura God Emperor's strengthened incarnation. However, he was well aware that he was still no match for the Shura God Emperor. The Shura God Emperor's power was still as strong as ever. In the future, when he entered the outer space and battled with the Azura God Emperor, he would need to be more careful and cautious. In addition, Ji Tianxing also learned about the forces that secretly sided with the Imperial Tutor and the Azura God Emperor. Although the Shimi Grotto Heaven had been investigating this matter, they had indeed found several factions. However, there were still a few fish that escaped the net and hid themselves well enough that Ji Tianxing got the answer from the memories of the Imperial Tutor soul. Ji Tianxing already knew the details of those forces. He planned to sort out this information and hand it over to the various forces of the Rebel Alliance so that they could eliminate the fish that had escaped the net. Among the many secrets, Ji Tianxing obtained the most important and also the most confidential information. According to the Imperial Tutor's knowledge, the Azura God Emperor and the other 4 God Emperors were doing their best to research the mystery of the gray fog at all costs, because the 5 God Emperors could sense the rich power of the heavenly Tao from the mystery of the gray fog, as well as an extremely terrifying aura of power. They firmly believed that in this vast void, even if there were 9 galaxies and billions of stars, they were all ordinary matters. Only the mystery of the gray fog, which contained supreme mysteries and power, seemed to let them see the location of the heavenly Tao. The 5 God Emperors all had a premonition that if they opened the mystery of the gray fog, they would be able to uncover the world's greatest secret and see the so-called heavenly Tao. In fact, if they could crack and control the mystery of the gray fog, they could even become immortal and control the heavenly Tao. Compared to immortality and control of the heavenly Tao, the continents of the God realm and the various galaxies were not even worth mentioning. However, the mystery of the gray fog was simply too mysterious and powerful. Even after spending 1,000 years of effort, the 5 God Emperors still could not pry into its secrets. They had brought many God Kings and God Lords with them to research and explore the mystery of the gray fog day and night, so it was only natural that they consumed vast amounts of cultivation resources. This was why the 5 God Emperors were so greedy and unrestrained in their plundering of cultivation resources. Before this, Ji Tianxing had wondered many times why the 5 God Emperors were researching the mystery of the gray fog at all costs. Just what was that mysterious sphere shrouded in the gray fog? If it could attract the attention of the five god emperors and make them neglect food and sleep to research it, it had to be the world's greatest treasure. It might even be related to the heavenly Tao, some mysterious power that had something to do with the god emperor realm. Now, the memories of the imperial tutor's divine soul proved that Ji Tianxing's guess was not completely correct, but it was in the right direction. Now that he had a rough idea of what was going on, he also had a corresponding conjecture and judgment regarding the five great god emperors' goals and plans. After refining the imperial tutor's godhead shard, he proceeded to refine the godhead shards of the other god kings. He had already learned many secrets from the imperial tutor. Thus, even if the other god kings knew some secrets, it would not be too important. Thus, Ji Tianxing did not waste any time in plundering the divine soul memories of those god kings. He refined another 20-some godhead shards one after another, and only when the time was up did he end his cultivation session. He had benefited greatly from this session of seclusion. Not only had the burial of heaven reached the peak of the king level, but he had also learned many secrets of the Azura god emperor. In addition, his energy had been strengthened, and his fighting strength was now more than 30 times that of an ordinary peak god king. The number of divine Tao laws he had grasped had reached 1,450. After Ji Tianxing came out of seclusion, Nangong Buhua hurriedly came to see him and reported on various aspects of the situation. First, the cave residence's renovation had been completed, and he requested Ji Tianxing to inspect and correct it. Second, the situation on the Boundless Heaven continent had stabilized, and the various forces under the Rebel Alliance had completed their tasks. Third, in accordance with Ji Tianxing's orders, Shimi Cave Heaven had commanded the intelligence forces to inquire about the situation outside the Boundless Heaven continent as early as a month ago. Now, the results of Shimi Cave Heaven's investigation were out. Just as Ji Tianxing had expected, the news of the Rebel Alliance launching a crusade against the Azura God Emperor, as well as their successive victories and seizing cities and territories, had long spread across the Boundless Heaven continent. Now, related news had spread across the Reincarnation Island, the Chinquin continent, and the Firmament continent. The people of those continents were very shocked by this news, and at the same time, they were also faintly looking forward to it. As for the fourth matter, Nangong Buhua asked Ji Tianxing if they should hold a ceremony to announce it to the world. Ji Tianxing had also considered this matter, although there was no practical significance in holding a grand ceremony. However, the symbolic meaning was very important. After all, he had ended the reign of the Azura God Emperor and become the new overlord of the Boundless Heaven continent. If he did not gather the 20 forces under him and the masters of hundreds of regions to hold a grand and solemn ceremony, it would be too informal. One had to know that he was now truly respected, supported, and loved by hundreds of millions of people. In the eyes of the people of the Boundless Heaven continent, he was the embodiment of justice and the heavenly Tao. No matter what, this ceremony had to be held, and it could not be small. Chapter 4194. If the ceremony was not held, Ji Tianxing could stay for another month or so until the situation was completely stabilized, and then he could leave the Boundless Heaven continent. But if the ceremony was held, he would not be able to leave within 2 months. After all, the leaders of the 20 forces of the Rebel Alliance, as well as hundreds of domain masters, had to be present. The preparations for the ceremony would also take a long time. Ji Tianxing estimated that 2 months would be very fast. He agreed to hold the ceremony and named it the Boundless Heaven Universal Ceremony. It not only represented the change of ownership of the Boundless Heaven continent and his succession to the position of Overlord, but also meant that hundreds of millions of people had regained their freedom and that the whole world would celebrate. The Boundless Heaven Universal Ceremony would still be hosted by the Nangong clan, and all the forces would cooperate. As for Ji Tianxing himself, he would still be a hands-off boss and only needed to command and make decisions. Nangong Buhua did not feel that it was tiring or busy. Instead, he happily acknowledged the order and went to draft the preliminary regulations. He was well aware that as the vice leader of the anti-rebellious alliance, he had to do everything himself. After all, after the Boundless Heaven Universal Ceremony ended and the situation on the continent stabilized, Ji Tianxing would leave to rescue the other continents. At that time, all the affairs of the Boundless Heaven continent would be managed and handled by him. If he could not even handle such a small matter, he would find it troublesome and busy. Then how could Ji Tianxing rest assured that he would be in charge of the entire Boundless Heaven continent? He had to show enough ability to be qualified for the position of deputy chief, so that Ji Tianxing would be assured and the other 19 forces would be convinced. Nangong Buhua was very efficient. After just half a day, he brought the newly drafted regulations to Ji Tianxing for a look. The two discussed in the study for 2 hours, and Ji Tianxing made some changes and additions to the regulations he had drafted. Some of the matters that Nangong Buhua did not consider thoroughly were further improved by Ji Tianxing. In this way, the two finalized the specific rules of Hao Yan's ecumenical ceremony, and Nangong Buhua began to carry out his task. He first used the name of Ji Tianxing to send a message to the 19 forces under the Rebel Alliance and over 100 domain masters to inform them of the time of the ceremony. Then, he mobilized more than 1,000 people of the Nangong clan and rushed to the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven to carry out the mission. He was going to lead 2,000 disciples to set up the venue of the ceremony in advance and do the preparatory work. The venue was near the entrance of the 9 Guards Cave Heaven, but it was not between the mountains and the earth, but above the vast sea of clouds. When the time came, the huge venue would not only have to accommodate the disciples of the 20 forces, but also nearly 100 region masters and their entourage. It would also have to accommodate millions of commoners. The venue above the Sea of Clouds had a radius of at least 1,000 miles. It was completely formed by cloud platforms and supported by a great formation. If he wanted to make the venue appear sacred and dignified, he would have to spend a lot of time and effort to set up many complicated formations and decorate it with many materials. It would take at least a month for the 2,000 disciples of the Nangong clan to do all these complicated and trivial things. In addition, the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven also needed a large number of guards, both to guard the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven and to show the prestige of the Kenshin. The requirements for the guards were higher. They had to be at least an upper-level Divine Lord. The captain of the guards and the governor had to be at least a Divine King. Most importantly, they had to recruit at least 5,000 guards to not look shabby. Even the 20 forces under the command of the Anti-Rebels Alliance would not be able to gather so many elite guards in such a short time. This was a difficult task. Fortunately, Nangong Buhua requested Ji Tianxing to announce to the world that they could openly recruit guards and form an army. Ji Tianxing, of course, nodded in agreement. He did not have to do the selection and assessment of the guards. He would leave it to Nangong Buhua. Nangong Buhua felt a little pressured, but he still accepted the task and promised to complete it on time. He had thought that would be difficult to complete this task, but he did not expect that 2 days after Kenshin's decree, many divine lords and divine kings would come to the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven to participate in the assessment. After asking around, Nangong Buhua found out that the divine lords and divine kings from all over the world had already arrived near the 9 Imperial Grotto Heaven. They had already thought of this half a month ago, so they had made preparations in advance. Nangong Buhua was relieved. He felt gratified and secretly relieved. The so-called assessment was very simple. There was no need to compete in an arena. It was mainly to test the divine lords and divine kings' strength, divine powers, and dharma spells to find out their background, and conduct. Those who met the requirements would be selected based on merit, and those who did not would be eliminated. The divine lords and divine kings who were selected would have to swear a heavenly Tao oath that Ji Tianxing had specially made to pass the assessment. The heavenly Tao oath was very strict and solemn, but it was not excessive. The purpose of the oath was, of course, to ensure the loyalty of the guards and to restrain their conduct. The heavenly Tao oath that Ji Tianxing had made was widely known in the Boundless Heaven continent, and everyone knew about it. Therefore, The divine lords and divine kings who came to participate in the assessment were already mentally prepared. If they wanted to be loyal to Kenshin and become guards of the 9 imperial grotto heaven, they had to swear loyalty. This was understandable. Therefore, the assessment went very smoothly. In just 10 days, more than 1,000 immortal emperors and more than 30 immortal kings passed Nangong Buhua's test and became guards of the 9 defense grotto heaven. This greatly reduced the pressure on Nangong Buhua, and he was confident that he could complete the task ahead of time. The 1,000 guards who passed the assessment thought that it would be very difficult, but they did not expect to achieve their wish so smoothly. They were also very glad that they were quick-witted. In the following days, many masters and experts from all over the world came to the 9 imperial grotto heaven to sign up for the assessment. After 1.5 months, more than 6,000 people passed the assessment and became guards of the 9 imperial grotto heaven. Among them, 6 high-level divine kings were commanders, 60 middle-level and low-level divine kings were guard captains, and the ordinary guards were all high-level divine lords. Therefore, the guard corps of the 9 imperial grotto heaven was officially established. Zhan Wushuang of the War God Clan and Lan Ji of the Lan Clan were respectively the Grand Governor and Vice Governor of the Guard Corps. Zhan Wushuang was the younger brother of the Ares clan leader and also the 4th elder of the Ares clan. In the past year of war, his performance was very outstanding, and Ji Tianxing appreciated his efficiency and ability in carrying out the task. Lan Ji and Zhan Wushuang had similar backgrounds, and they were both elders of the Lan clan. They were both brave and loyal, and their ability was outstanding. Ji Tianxing appointed them to lead the Guard Corps because he trusted the Ares clan and the Lan clan. When the Guard Corps was established, the clan leaders, and elders of the 19 forces also arrived. Nearly 100 territorial masters also arrived at the 9 imperial grotto heaven one after another. With more manpower, the layout and preparation of the venue were quickly completed. 8 days before the ceremony began, everything was ready.